Hey there, welcome to Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now, settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The morning of August 27, 2015, began like countless other late summer days in the Mirabella community of St. Johns County, Florida. Nestled within the World Golf Village area near St. Augustine, this upscale neighborhood was known for its manicured lawns, quiet cul-de-sacs, and the kind of peaceful suburban atmosphere where families felt safe. Young mothers pushed strollers along sidewalks, neighbors waved to one another, and children played in yards without a second thought. It was the type of place where people moved to escape the chaos of the world, to build lives of stability and comfort. But on this particular Thursday morning, that illusion of safety would be shattered forever, and the names Amanda Colley and Lindy Dobbins would become forever linked to one of the most heartbreaking tragedies the community had ever witnessed. Amanda Cloninger Colley was 31 years old, a mother navigating one of the most difficult chapters of her life. Her marriage to James Terry Colley Jr. had deteriorated beyond repair, and she was in the midst of divorcing him. What had once perhaps been a hopeful union had descended into something dark and controlling. Amanda had taken the difficult but necessary step of filing for a domestic violence injunction, a legal protection order meant to keep her estranged husband away from her and their home. The court papers she filed painted a disturbing picture of obsession and threatened violence, with Amanda writing that James would harm or even take her life if given the chance. Despite the legal barrier between them, James Colley refused to let go. He had already moved on to a new romantic relationship, yet he remained fixated on Amanda, consumed by jealousy and suspicion that she too had found someone new. The night before that fateful Thursday, Amanda had been away from her home on South Bellagio Drive. James, unable to control his obsessive need to monitor her life, had driven to the house in the middle of the night after his new girlfriend fell asleep. He knew Amanda wasn't there, and he let himself inside. What he discovered ignited a rage that would set the stage for the horror to come. He found items that confirmed what he already suspected. Amanda had indeed moved on and was seeing someone else. In a fit of fury, James gathered Amanda's clothing from the closet and burned them in the backyard, a symbolic destruction that spoke to his need to erase and control. But he didn't stop there. He methodically ransacked the house, tearing through rooms, overturning furniture, and leaving a scene of chaos and violation that would greet Amanda when she returned home the next morning. When Amanda walked through her front door around 9 o'clock that Thursday morning, the sight that met her eyes was devastating. Her home, her sanctuary, had been violated. Everything was in disarray, pulled apart and thrown about with deliberate malice. She immediately knew who was responsible. Her hands shaking, Amanda used FaceTime to call her boyfriend, Lamar Dauberly, to show him the destruction. The video call revealed the extent of the damage, belongings scattered, furniture overturned, and the unmistakable mark of James's vindictive rage stamped across every room. Lamar didn't hesitate. He drove immediately to Amanda's house and called the police non-emergency line to report the incident. A public service assistance officer arrived at the home just before 10 o'clock in the morning. The officer documented the damage and spoke with Amanda, who was clearly shaken but trying to remain composed. When asked if she wanted to file formal charges against her estranged husband, Amanda hesitated. She told the officer she needed time, that she wanted to speak with her mother and her attorney before making that decision. Perhaps she feared escalating the situation further, or perhaps some part of her still hoped to resolve things peacefully through legal channels. The officer left, and Amanda was not alone for long. Two of her closest friends, Women who had become her support system during this difficult time arrived to comfort her. Lindy Dobbins was one of Amanda's dearest friends, a fellow mother who understood the joys and challenges of raising young children. The two women, along with their mutual friend Rachel Hendricks, had formed a tight bond over the years, often watching each other's children and spending time together in the neighborhood. They were there for one another through the everyday struggles and celebrations of motherhood, and now Lindy and Rachel had come to support Amanda in one of her darkest moments. The three women, along with Lamar, gathered in Amanda's home, trying to process what had happened and determine the best course of action. None of them knew that while they talked and tried to comfort Amanda, James Colley was preparing to make the situation infinitely worse. Earlier that same morning, James had been required to appear in court. The hearing was related to a violation of the domestic violence injunction that prohibited him from going near Amanda or her home. He had already broken the terms of that protective order, and now he stood before a judge to answer for his actions. Witnesses who saw James after the hearing would later testify that he was furious, his anger barely contained. Family members who spoke with him urged him not to do anything he would regret, pleading with him to think clearly and not let his emotions drive him to make a terrible mistake. But their words fell on deaf ears. James had already made up his mind about what he was going to do. Less than 2 hours after leaving that courthouse, James Colley was behind the wheel of his car, driving toward Amanda's home in Mirabella. He had armed himself with not one but 2 handguns, a 9mm pistol, and a .45 caliber weapon. The 20-minute drive gave him ample time to reconsider, to turn back, to choose a different path. His father, sensing the danger, called him during that drive and begged him to stop, to turn around and come home. James refused. He continued on, his mind locked onto a single, devastating purpose. Less than half an hour before he arrived at Amanda's house, he stopped at a gas station, where surveillance footage would later show him calmly shopping, appearing outwardly composed even as he prepared to commit an unthinkable act. Back at the house on South Bellagio Drive, Amanda and her friends had no warning of what was about to unfold. The 4 of them, Amanda, Lindy, Rachel, and Lamar, were still processing the trauma of the ransacked home when James arrived. He approached the house carefully, deliberately concealing himself as he moved closer. He wasn't there to talk or to negotiate. He was there with a clear and horrifying intent. The first shots rang out from outside the home, shattering the morning quiet and sending terror through everyone inside. Amanda immediately grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice frantic and desperate as she tried to convey the emergency to the dispatcher. In the background of that call, the sounds of gunfire continued, each shot a hammer blow of violence and fear. Lindy Dobbins, who had come only to comfort her friend, also managed to call 911 just 14 seconds after Amanda's call. Her voice was filled with terror as she screamed that she had been shot, that someone needed to help them. Rachel Hendricks, acting on pure instinct, tried to barricade herself and the others in a closet, holding the door shut as James attempted to force his way inside. Through the door, James shouted a chilling ultimatum. Let him in or he would shoot through the door. True to his word, he opened fire, bullets tearing through the wood and striking Rachel's arm, grazing her but not stopping her. When James finally forced the door open, Rachel found herself standing behind it, momentarily concealed by the swing of the door itself. In that split second, she made a desperate decision and bolted from the closet, running for her life. As Rachel fled, her mind raced with the certainty that James would shoot her in the back at any moment. She braced herself for the impact, for the pain, but somehow she made it out of the house alive. Lamar Dowbally also managed to escape the chaos, both of them running into the neighborhood to get help. But Lindy and Amanda were not so fortunate. Lindy, who had been hiding behind a chest in the closet, was cornered by James. She screamed as he raised his weapon, a final plea that went unheard. James shot her without hesitation, without a word. Lindy Dobbins, a mother, a friend, a woman who had simply been there to support someone she cared about, was shot 3 times. Her life ended in that closet, her body falling amid the chaos and terror. After killing Lindy, James turned his attention to finding Amanda. She had tried to hide in the bathroom, perhaps hoping that help would arrive in time, that somehow this nightmare would end. But James tracked her down, and what happened next was an act of such brutal finality that it would later be described by the state attorney as among the most callous and violent acts he had ever witnessed in his career. James shot Amanda repeatedly. When his 9mm handgun ran out of ammunition, he dropped it and pulled out his .45 caliber weapon, continuing to fire until Amanda stopped moving. In total, Amanda Cloninger Colley was shot 9 times by the man she had once married, the father of her child. Her desperate 911 call, which had captured the sounds of gunfire and her own pleas for help, fell silent. The neighborhood that had been so quiet and peaceful just minutes before was now swarming with law enforcement. Multiple schools in the area were placed on lockdown as police launched an intensive search for James Colley, fearing he might attempt to flee or harm others. The community was gripped with fear, parents terrified that the gunman might go after the children next. But James did not run far. After leaving Amanda's house, he made phone calls to his father and sisters, calmly informing them that he had shot Amanda and killed her. He was located and arrested, bringing an end to the immediate threat, but leaving behind a community shattered by violence and 2 families forever devastated by loss. The investigation and subsequent legal proceedings would lay bare the full scope of what had happened that morning. James Terry Colley Jr., then 38 years old, was charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, 2 counts of burglary, and 1 count of aggravated stalking after injunction. The evidence against him was overwhelming. There were the 911 calls, which captured the sounds of the attack in real time. There was testimony from Rachel Hendricks and Lamar Dalberly, who had witnessed the horror firsthand and barely escaped with their lives. There was the physical evidence, the ransacked house, the weapons, the spent shell casings. And there was the timeline, which showed that James had acted with deliberation and premeditation, arming himself, ignoring pleas from his family to stop, and approaching the house in a manner designed to conceal his presence until it was too late. In July of 2018, nearly 3 years after the murders, James Colley's case went to trial. The jury heard testimony that painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and rage, unable to accept that his estranged wife had moved on with her life. They heard about the pattern of stalking in violation of the protective order, about the night James had broken into Amanda's home to burn her clothes, about the court hearing just hours before the murders where he had been confronted with his own illegal behavior. They heard the 911 calls, listened to the fear in the voices of Amanda and Lindy, and saw the aftermath captured in crime scene photographs. The defense attempted to argue that James had been impaired at the time of the shootings, suggesting that his use of the sleep medication Ambien had affected his judgment. But the prosecution presented evidence that directly contradicted this claim. James had calmly and rationally participated in the court hearing that morning. He had stopped at a gas station and behaved normally. He had driven for 20 minutes, giving himself ample time to reconsider. He had armed himself in advance and approached the scene deliberately. The victims had not provoked him in any way. After deliberating for just 2 hours, the 12-member jury returned with their verdict. James Terry Colley Jr. was found guilty on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder for the deaths of Amanda Colley and Lindy Dobbins, 2 counts of attempted murder for the shooting of Rachel Hendricks and Lamar Dalberly, and multiple other felonies. State Attorney R.J. Larizza addressed the press after the verdict, acknowledging the pain that the trial had caused for the families and friends of the victims. He described the facts of the case as among the most callous and violent he had ever encountered, and announced that his office would be seeking the death penalty. The penalty phase of the trial followed, during which the jury heard victim impact statements and considered whether James Colley deserved the ultimate punishment under Florida law. The jury unanimously recommended death for both murder counts. On November 30th, 2018, Circuit Judge Howard Maltz sentenced James Terry Colley Jr. to death for the murders of Amanda Colley and Lindy Dobbins. The judge's decision reflected the calculated nature of the crime, the suffering inflicted on the victims, and the devastating impact on the families left behind. James Colley's legal team filed an appeal, arguing among other things that the trial court had erred in its instructions to the jury, that Florida's death penalty statute was unconstitutional, and that the evidence of impairment should have been given more weight. But in November of 2020, the Florida Supreme Court unanimously rejected the appeal and upheld both the convictions and the death sentences. The justices found that the evidence of premeditation and deliberation was overwhelming, and that James Colley had been afforded a fair trial. The decision brought a measure of legal closure to a case that had captivated and horrified the region, though no court ruling could ever restore what had been taken from the families of Amanda Colley and Lindy Dobbins. In the years since the tragedy, the Mirabella community has worked to honor the memories of the two women who lost their lives that day. A park was dedicated in their names, a place where children can play and families can gather, a living testament to the bonds of friendship and the value of every life. For Amanda's children, for Lindy's family, and for the friends who survived that morning, the pain remains. Rachel Hendricks and Lamar Dauberly carry the trauma of what they witnessed, the knowledge that they escaped while their loved ones did not. They live with the memories of gunfire, of desperate 911 calls, of running for their lives while behind them, two women were being taken from this world in an act of incomprehensible violence. The case of Amanda Colley and Lindy Dobbins stands as a stark reminder of the dangers posed by domestic violence and obsessive control. Amanda had done everything she was supposed to do. She had filed for divorce. She had obtained a protective order. She had called the police when her home was vandalized. But the systems designed to protect her were not enough to stop a man who had decided that if he could not have her, no one would. Lindy Dobbins paid the ultimate price simply for being a good friend, for showing up when someone she cared about needed support. Their deaths left a void that can never be filled, families forever incomplete, children growing up without mothers, and a community forever marked by the memory of that August morning. James Terry Colley Jr. now sits on death row in Florida, awaiting the execution of his sentence. The legal appeals may continue for years, as they often do in capital cases, but the facts remain unchanged. The story of Amanda and Lindy is a tragedy in the truest sense, a reminder that behind every statistic about domestic violence and every headline about murder, there are real people whose lives mattered, whose absences are felt every single day, and whose memories deserve to be honored with the truth of what was taken from them. Story 2. The cold Kentucky night of January 4th, 2019, carried with it an air of celebration and escape for Savannah Spurlock, a young woman who had spent every waking moment of recent months caring for 4 small children. At just 22 years old, she was the mother of a 4-year-old son, a 2-year-old boy, and twin baby boys who had entered the world merely 6 weeks earlier. The weight of responsibility pressed upon her young shoulders like a physical thing, relentless and exhausting. Her days blurred together in a cascade of diaper changes, feedings, sleepless nights, and the constant juggling of bills that never seemed to stop coming. Tonight, however, was supposed to be different. Tonight was for her. Savannah lived with her mother, Ellen, in Richmond, Kentucky, a modest town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Ellen had agreed to watch the children, giving her daughter a precious opportunity to shed the mantle of motherhood for just a few hours and remember what it felt like to be young and carefree. Savannah had put on her makeup with care, styled her hair, and climbed into a car with 2 friends who promised her a night of dancing and laughter at the other bar in Lexington. The bar pulsed with music and energy, bodies moving in rhythm, drinks flowing freely. For Savannah, it was a brief reprieve from the unrelenting demands of her life. But as the night wore on, her friends began to peel away. One had to wake early the next morning. The other left following an argument, the details of which would fade into insignificance against what was to come. By the time the clock struck the early morning hours, Savannah found herself alone in the crowded bar, tipsy and vulnerable. She was not ready to go home yet, not ready to return to the crying babies and the mountain of responsibilities waiting for her. So she stayed, talking to strangers, drinking, letting the alcohol numb the edges of her exhaustion. Somewhere in those bleary hours, she encountered three men. Their names were David Sparks, a 23-year-old who would later become the central figure in A Nightmare, and two others whose identities would emerge only in the investigation that followed. Surveillance cameras captured the moment at approximately 2:30 in the morning, when Savannah left the other bar with these three men. She walked out into the frigid night air, her breath visible in small clouds, her judgment clouded by alcohol and the desire for continued companionship. She had no way of knowing that this decision would seal her fate. 15 minutes after leaving the bar, Savannah made what would be her final contact with her family. She FaceTimed her mother Ellen, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of a phone screen. Two men sat beside her in the vehicle. She told her mother she would be home in the morning, her voice carrying the slurred edges of intoxication, but also a note of reassurance. Ellen could see the men in the frame, strangers whose faces would later be seared into her memory as the last people to see her daughter alive. The third man was driving separately in another vehicle. After that brief call, Savannah Spurlock vanished into the darkness. When morning came and Savannah did not return home, Ellen's worry began as a small knot in her stomach that quickly expanded into full-blown panic. This was not like her daughter. Savannah would never abandon her children, especially not her newborn twins who depended on her for everything. Ellen called Savannah's phone repeatedly, each unanswered ring amplifying her terror. She reached out to Savannah's friends, to anyone who might know where she was. The hours stretched into an agonizing day, and then another. On January 7, 2019, 3 days after Savannah disappeared, Ellen reported her daughter missing to the Richmond Police Department. The investigation that followed consumed the next 6 months with a desperate intensity. Richmond Police, working alongside Kentucky State Police and multiple local agencies, followed every lead, chased every tip, conducted searches across Garrett County and central Kentucky. Volunteers combed through fields and wooded areas, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the missing young mother. Meanwhile, investigators worked to identify and locate the three men last seen with Savannah. Surveillance footage from the other bar provided crucial evidence, and within days, police had identified all three individuals. David Sparks was among them. When detectives arrived to question him, he presented a story that seemed almost rehearsed in its simplicity. He claimed that Savannah had come back to his house that night, that she had fallen asleep, and that she later woke him up to ask where she was. He told investigators that he gave her his address and went back to sleep. When he woke again, she was gone. The story was neat, tidy, easily explained. But investigators were not convinced. The other two men were also interviewed and eventually cleared in the missing persons investigation. Police released them without charges, but David Sparks remained a person of interest, a shadow of suspicion that detectives could not shake. Sparks lived on a property in rural Garrett County that belonged to his family. It was a sprawling piece of land with outbuildings and a strawberry patch, the kind of place where a person could disappear into the landscape. Investigators searched the property in the months following Savannah's disappearance, walking the grounds, looking for any evidence that she had been there. They found nothing. Detective Fraze, who would later reflect on the case with haunting regret, even stood directly on the strawberry patch where Savannah's body lay hidden beneath the soil. He could not have known that mere inches below his feet, wrapped in plastic trash bags and folded into an unnatural position, was the young mother whose face stared back at him from missing person flyers. 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to the oppressive heat of a Kentucky summer. Savannah's 4 children grew older without their mother. Her twin boys reached milestones she would never witness. Ellen held on to hope, even as it became increasingly fragile, even as the rational part of her mind began to accept the terrible truth that her daughter was likely dead. The case remained open, but leads had dried up. The search efforts slowed, and then on July 10, 2019, everything changed. A relative of David Sparks, who had access to the family property in Agar County, noticed something disturbing. A foul odor emanated from the land, thick and unmistakable. It was the smell of decay, of death. Concerned and disturbed, the relative contacted police. Authorities returned to the property they had searched months earlier, this time guided by the nauseating scent. They began to dig in the strawberry patch. 19 inches below the surface, they found her. Savannah Spurlock's body was wrapped in plastic trash bags, her feet bound with tape. Her body had been folded over in the shallow grave, a rug from David Sparks' bedroom positioned behind her back to help conceal her. The discovery was as gruesome as it was heartbreaking. After 6 months of searching, of hoping against hope, Savannah's family received the news they had dreaded. Their beloved daughter, mother, sister, and friend was dead. She had been there all along, buried on the very property investigators had searched, hidden beneath the earth in a grave dug by the hands of a killer. David Sparks was arrested on July 11, 2019, one day after Savannah's remains were discovered. He was initially charged with abuse of a corpse and tampering with physical evidence. Authorities were cautious, methodical. They needed to build a case that would hold up in court. Forensic evidence began to paint a damning picture. Blood found on a closet door in Sparks' bedroom was tested and matched Savannah's DNA. The rug that had been used to help conceal her body was traced back to his home. The location of the grave, the manner in which the body was hidden, the physical evidence tying Savannah to Sparks' residence, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. As the investigation deepened, additional charges came. David Sparks was formally charged with murder. The case against him was overwhelming. Investigators, including Detective Fraze, who had led much of the search, were confident that Sparks had acted alone. There was no evidence to suggest that the other 2 men who had been with Savannah that night were involved in her death. Sparks had taken her to his home, and whatever happened there, it ended with Savannah's life being violently extinguished and her body hidden in the ground like refuse. The legal proceedings stretched over more than a year. Sparks initially entered a not guilty plea. His defense attorneys and the prosecution combed through mountains of evidence, preparing for what promised to be a difficult and emotionally charged trial. But as the case moved forward, the weight of the evidence appeared insurmountable. On December 1, 2020, a day that coincidentally marked the 2nd birthday of Savannah's twin boys, David Sparks stood in Agar County Circuit Court and changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to murder, tampering with physical evidence, and abuse of a corpse. In open court, he admitted to intentionally causing Savannah Spurlock's death. Commonwealth Attorney Andy Sims, who had prosecuted the case, stood before the judge and outlined the terms of a plea agreement. In exchange for Sparks' guilty plea, the prosecution recommended a sentence of 50 years in prison for the murder charge and 5 years for abuse of a corpse to run concurrently. The death penalty had never been an option in this case because certain aggravating factors required under Kentucky law were not present. On December 17, 2020, David Sparks was formally sentenced. The judge accepted the plea agreement, and Sparks received 50 years in prison. Under Kentucky law, he would be eligible to appear before the parole board after serving 20 years. For Savannah's family, the sentence was both a relief and a source of deep frustration. There would be no trial, no need to sit through days of testimony, reliving the horror of what had happened to their loved one. But justice, in their eyes, felt incomplete. Shaq Smith, the father of 3 of Savannah's children, expressed his disappointment publicly, stating that he felt the 50-year sentence was not enough. The authorities never publicly revealed exactly how Savannah died. The cause of death remained undisclosed, a detail that perhaps mercifully spared her family from even more agonizing knowledge. Similarly, David Sparks never provided a motive for why he killed her. The question of what transpired in those early morning hours of January 5, 2019, in Sparks' home remains partially shrouded in darkness. What is known is that Savannah Spurlock, a young woman who had fought so hard to provide for her children despite overwhelming odds, met a brutal end at the hands of a man she had just met. Detective Fraze, reflecting on the case after its conclusion, spoke with palpable emotion about the investigation. He questioned how they had missed Savannah's body during the initial search of Sparks' property, how he had stood directly above her grave without realizing she was there. The guilt of that failure weighed heavily on him. But he also emphasized a crucial point that should never be forgotten. Savannah Spurlock was entirely innocent. She was a victim in every sense of the word. Nothing she did that night, not going to the bar, not staying after her friends left, not leaving with 3 strangers, justified what happened to her. The fault, the responsibility, the evil of that night rested solely on David Sparks. Savannah's story is one of a young mother who was trying her best in circumstances that would have broken many people. She had 4 children by the age of 22, a reality that brought both immense joy and crushing pressure. She had dropped out of Eastern Kentucky University to focus on raising her sons, working multiple jobs as a lifeguard and at a restaurant to make ends meet. She had dreams and struggles, moments of happiness and periods of despair. She was, in every way, a real person with a real life, not just a headline or a statistic. Her mother Ellen and her children were left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by senseless violence. The 4 boys, Noah, Jace, Zane, and Zuri, would grow up without their mother, their memories of her limited to photographs and the stories told by those who loved her. The twins would have no memory of her at all. Ellen, who had watched her grandsons while Savannah went out for what should have been a harmless night of fun, now carried the burden of raising those children in the wake of unspeakable tragedy. David Sparks sits in prison today, his name forever linked to a crime that horrified a community and devastated a family. He admitted his guilt, sparing the legal system and Savannah's loved ones the ordeal of a trial, but he never explained why. Perhaps there is no explanation that would suffice, no rationale that could make sense of taking a young mother away from her children and burying her in the ground like something disposable. Savannah Spurlock's life mattered. Her death was not just a tragedy, but an injustice that reverberates through the lives of everyone who knew and loved her. She deserved to watch her children grow, to see them graduate from school, to hold grandchildren of her own someday. Instead, her story ends in a shallow grave on a cold piece of Kentucky farmland, a life extinguished far too soon by a man she trusted for just one night. The case serves as a stark reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly a single decision can lead to irreversible consequences, and how the people left behind must find a way to carry on in the face of unimaginable loss. Story 3. The house stood quiet on the gray afternoon of February 28, 2007, in the small provincial town of Nivelles, Belgium. Inside, 5 children gathered in front of the television, their laughter punctuating the silence as they watched Spy Kids 3. Yasmin, the eldest at 14, had just returned from a dermatology appointment with her mother. 12-year-old Nora sat nearby, while 10-year-old Miriam settled into the familiar comfort of their home. 7-year-old Mina and 3-year-old Mehdi, the youngest and only boy, completed the circle of siblings. Their father, Bouchaid McAdam, was away in Morocco visiting family, expected to return that very day. None of them knew that within hours, their lives would end at the hands of the woman who had brought them into the world. Genevieve Lermite was born on November 16, 1966, in Brussels, the eldest daughter of Michel Lermite, a businessman and student, and Marina Scuvart, a nurse. She grew up with 2 younger sisters, Catherine and Mireille, in what appeared to be an ordinary Belgian family. Though she struggled with self-confidence and her coursework during her secondary studies, Genevieve persevered, eventually graduating in 1991 with a diploma in French and history from the Educational Institute of Social Promotion of the French Community in Ucla. It was during her studies, in the academic year of 1988 to 1989, that she met Bouchaid McAdam, a young man studying mathematics and physics. Their connection blossomed into romance, and on September 22, 1990, they married, beginning what seemed like a promising life together. From the start, however, their marriage was complicated by an unusual living arrangement. The couple moved into the apartment of Dr. Michel Char, a physician who had befriended McAdam's family in Morocco during the 1980s and served as his host and benefactor in Belgium. McAdam considered Shar an adoptive father figure, a man who had given him opportunities in a foreign country. While McAdam worked at a convenience store, it was Shar who became the family's primary financial provider. Genevieve agreed to the arrangement, believing it would be temporary, a stepping stone toward their independence. But temporary became permanent, and what began as gratitude slowly transformed into something darker. In 1991, Genevieve secured a position as a teacher, a role that brought her professional fulfillment. Shortly after, on August 13, 1992, she gave birth to Yasmin, her first child. 3 years later, Nora arrived on February 13, 1995. The joy of motherhood, however, came with unexpected shadows. Following Nora's birth, Genevieve suffered from postpartum depression severe enough that she was granted leave from her teaching position from June 1, 1995 to August 31, 1996. This period marked the beginning of her long struggle with mental illness, a battle that would intensify over the years. After Yasmin's birth, Shar purchased a house for the extended family, dedicating his apartment to his medical practice. In 1996, he hired McAdam as his filing assistant part-time, later making the position full-time in 1998. Throughout this period, Shar continued to cover most expenses, including vacations, house repairs, monthly allowances, and life insurance for each family member. The family continued to grow. Miriam was born on April 20, 1997, followed by Mina on May 20, 1999. Eventually, the family moved from Brussels to the provincial town of Nivelles, where Shar purchased another home. He paid the mortgage and lived on the second floor, while Genevieve, McAdam, and their children occupied the rest of the house. The arrangement that had begun as temporary charity had become permanent dependence, and the walls of the house seemed to close in around Genevieve with each passing year. Her fifth child, Mehdi, was born on August 9, 2003, the only son among her children. Tensions began rising between Genevieve and her husband. McAdam spent long hours away from home, becoming a regular at a local bar and spa. Several times each year, he would travel to Marrakesh to visit his family, with trips lasting anywhere from a week to a month. Genevieve felt increasingly isolated, trapped in a house that belonged to another man, married to a husband who seemed perpetually absent. In 2004, recognizing her deteriorating mental state, Shar recommended that she see a psychiatrist. The following year, in 2005, she began consulting with a psychiatrist named Diederik Veldekens. She was reported to be seriously mentally ill and had been battling with psychiatric difficulties for years. Despite this treatment, the darkness continued to gather. On the morning of February 28, 2007, Genevieve went through the motions of an ordinary day. She took Yasmin to her dermatology appointment, then picked up the rest of her children from school and prepared lunch for them. But something was different that day. As she moved through these familiar tasks, she heard a voice in her mind telling her, "The machine is running." The words echoed through her consciousness, a signal that something terrible had been set in motion. She gathered 2 items, jewelry for her sisters and a letter for her friend Valerie. In the letter, her anguish spilled onto the page. She called Shar, who had stolen the intimacy between herself, McAdam, and their children. She accused her husband of being deaf and blind to her concerns about Shar's presence in their lives. After mailing the letters, she went to a grocery store and slipped 2 kitchen knives into her shopping bag. When she returned home, the children were still watching their movie. Genevieve hid the knives in a drawer, her hands steady despite the storm raging in her mind. She called Mina over first, away from her siblings. The 7-year-old came willingly, trusting her mother completely. Genevieve tried to strangle her, but when the child struggled, she resorted to the knife. Even as she slashed her daughter's throat, she spoke comforting words, apologizing, as though she could somehow soften the horror of what she was doing. 3-year-old Mehdi was next. Again, she attempted strangulation, and again, when it failed, she used the knife. She washed the blade in the bathroom sink afterward, a grotesque parody of domestic routine. Miriam, aged 10, was told she had a surprise waiting in the office. Excited and unsuspecting, she followed her mother into the room. Genevieve instructed her to sit in a chair and wear a blue handkerchief over her eyes. Once her daughter was seated and blindfolded, Genevieve picked up a marble plaque and smashed it over her head before cutting her throat. 12-year-old Nora, reportedly Dr. Shar's favorite goddaughter, was asked to sit in a chair. From behind, Genevieve slit her throat. Afterward, in a moment of profound psychological disturbance, Yasmin, the eldest at 14, was the last. Genevieve called her over, using the same words she had with Miriam, promising a surprise. But Yasmin was older, perhaps more alert to the strange atmosphere in the house. When her mother attacked from behind as she entered the office, Yasmin managed to dodge the knife by diving to the ground. A desperate struggle ensued, the teenage girl fighting for her life against her own mother. She suffered multiple stab wounds before Genevieve finally stabbed her in the back and cut her throat. The house fell silent except for the sound of the television, still playing in the empty room. With all 5 of her children dead, Genevieve attempted to complete what she had planned. She tried to kill herself by falling on the knife, but the wound was not fatal. Realizing she would survive, she wrote "Call the police" in red marker on her door and dialed emergency services. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found something that would haunt them forever. The 5 children had been tucked into their beds by their mother, some with stuffed toys placed carefully in their arms. It was a final, terrible gesture of maternal care, as though she could somehow make them comfortable in death. The trial began on December 8, 2008, nearly 2 years after the murders, and lasted approximately 2 weeks, concluding on December 19, 2008, in the Assize Court of Brabant-Wallen in Nivelles. The courtroom was packed with observers, journalists, and those seeking to understand how such unspeakable horror could occur. Genevieve's lawyers were Daniel Sprudels and Xavier Magne, and the jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men. Genevieve confessed to murdering her children, so the trial focused not on whether she had committed the crimes, but on what had driven her to such an act. Prosecutor Pierre Ranz opened with a description of the scene that had met emergency services on that February day, painting a picture of devastation that left the courtroom in stunned silence. He asked for a sentence of 30 years in prison. The defense presented psychiatric evidence that Genevieve was not of sound mind when she committed the acts. Multiple psychiatrists testified that she should not be held fully accountable for her actions due to her severe mental illness. They recommended that she be admitted to a psychiatric prison rather than a regular prison, arguing that she needed treatment more than punishment. Genevieve had been battling with psychiatric difficulties for many years, and she told the court that she had seen the murder of her children and her own suicide as her only way out of her unbearable situation. She described feeling trapped, suffocated by the presence of Shar in her home and by her husband's emotional absence. In her disturbed state, she believed that death was the only escape for herself and her children. The jury, however, did not follow the psychiatric recommendations. On December 19, 2008, they found Genevieve guilty of 5 counts of premeditated murder and sentenced her to the maximum penalty, life imprisonment. The court took no extenuating circumstances into account, despite the psychiatric evidence. In her closing argument, Genevieve said she would accept any punishment the court gave her and showed remorse for her actions. She was led away to begin serving her sentence, but the case was far from over. In 2010, Genevieve filed a civil lawsuit seeking €3 million in damages against her former psychiatrist, Diederik Veldekens. She claimed that had he rushed to see her when she was in her disturbed state, the crime would not have been committed. She wanted recognition of the harm she believed his alleged inaction had caused. During the original trial, Veldekens had testified that he met with Genevieve after receiving an alarming letter from her, but could not see her again on February 13, 2007, due to his full schedule. In December 2011, the case was dismissed. The court ruled that the charges against the psychiatrist were irrelevant, finding no legal basis for her claim. She abandoned the legal battle after 10 years without success. In 2019, 12 years after the murders, Genevieve was transferred from regular prison to a psychiatric facility. By this point, Belgium's euthanasia laws allowed people to choose to end their lives if they were deemed to be suffering from unbearable psychological suffering that could not be healed. Genevieve began the process of requesting euthanasia, claiming that her psychological suffering was irreversible. The request was controversial, raising profound questions about justice, mental illness, and the nature of suffering. Some argued that the guilt she felt for killing her children was precisely the kind of moral suffering that a person should bear, not escape through death. Others suggested that if she had indeed acted during a severe mental break, her subsequent guilt and anguish represented a form of torture from which there was no recovery. On February 28, 2023, exactly 16 years to the day after she had murdered her 5 children, Genevieve Lermite was euthanized at the age of 56. She died in a hospital in Montigny-le-Tilleul, Belgium, choosing the anniversary of her children's deaths as her own. Her lawyer, Nicholas Cohen, confirmed the death, which had been carried out according to Belgian law. Some speculated that choosing this particular date was her way of joining her children, or perhaps of finishing what she had started on that terrible day in 2007. The case of Genevieve Lermite remains one of the most tragic and controversial in Belgian history, raising enduring questions about mental illness, criminal responsibility, suffering, and justice. Bouchab McAdam, who had returned from Morocco that day to find his entire family destroyed, rebuilt his life in the aftermath. In February 2010, he married Azmi Beldi, a professor of Islamic law, and they had a daughter about a year later. But the shadow of that day never left him. He spoke of feeling disgusted and revolted by aspects of the Belgian legal system that required him to pay the court costs from the trial, which totaled over 72,000 euros. The story of Genevieve Lermite defies easy understanding. It is a story of a woman who loved her children enough to tuck them into bed after death, yet who took their lives with her own hands. It is a story of mental illness that went unchecked until it exploded into violence. It is a story of a family structure that became a prison, of a marriage that offered no escape, of voices that commanded unspeakable acts. Most of all, it is a reminder that behind every headline about unimaginable crimes are human beings whose suffering, while never excusing their actions, demands to be acknowledged and understood. The 5 children, Yasmin, Nora, Miriam, Mina, and Mehdi, never had the chance to grow up, to pursue their dreams, to experience the fullness of life. Their deaths remain an irredeemable tragedy, a wound in the fabric of their community that can never fully heal. Story 4. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over Evansville, Indiana, on October 19, 2021, as Timothy Scott Ivy prepared for what he thought would be an exciting evening. At 50 years old, Tim had found something he had not expected at this stage of his life: a meaningful relationship with a woman named Amanda Sieb. They had been dating for just over a year, and their connection had grown into something comfortable and genuine. Tim was a devoted father to his adult daughter and son, a man known to his family for his loving nature and steady presence in their lives. He could not have known, as he and Amanda made plans for that October evening, that he had less than 12 hours left to live. Amanda Sieb had been exploring a dating application, looking to meet new people and perhaps expand the social circle she shared with Tim. In the digital age, such apps had become commonplace, offering seemingly endless possibilities for connection. Through one of these platforms, Amanda had matched with a woman who called herself Heidi Carter. The two women had exchanged messages, building a rapport that seemed friendly and genuine. Heidi mentioned that she had a boyfriend named Carrie Hammond, and she suggested that perhaps the 4 of them could meet up together, maybe explore the possibilities that came with couples connecting in unconventional ways. It seemed harmless enough, maybe even exciting. What Amanda did not know What she could not have known from the carefully curated profile and messages was that nearly everything Heidi Carter had told her was a lie. The woman behind the screen had constructed an elaborate fiction, presenting a version of herself that bore little resemblance to reality. Behind the friendly messages and casual suggestions lay something far darker than Amanda could have imagined. But on that October afternoon, believing she was simply meeting a new friend, Amanda extended an invitation to Tim. Would he be interested in meeting this couple she had connected with online? Tim, trusting Amanda's judgment and curious about the evening ahead, agreed. Heidi Carter lived in a house on Stinson Avenue, on Evansville's west side. It was an unremarkable residence in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors might wave in passing, but largely kept to their own concerns. Inside that house, Heidi Carter lived with Carrie David Hammond, her boyfriend, and the dynamic between them was complicated in ways that outsiders could not easily perceive. Heidi had a history that included violence, a criminal record that painted a picture of someone capable of unpredictable and dangerous behavior. But Amanda and Tim knew none of this as they drove to Stinson Avenue that evening, believing they were simply meeting new friends. When Amanda and Tim arrived at the house, they were welcomed inside by Heidi and Carrie. The initial interactions likely seemed normal enough, the awkward pleasantries that come with meeting strangers for the first time. But somewhere in those first minutes or hours, the evening took a turn that would transform what was supposed to be a social gathering into a nightmare. According to the testimony that Amanda would later provide to law enforcement and in court, she and Tim found themselves engaged in consensual, intimate activity with the couple in Heidi's bedroom. It was the kind of situation that, however unconventional, should have remained a private matter between adults. But Carrie Hammond had a pattern of behavior that would prove catastrophic. He had a habit of arriving at Heidi's home at a particular time, and on this evening, he walked into the bedroom at his usual hour. What he witnessed when he entered that room triggered a violent rage that would escalate beyond anything that could have been anticipated. Hammond saw Tim with Heidi, and something inside him snapped. He grabbed a baseball bat and began striking Tim with brutal force. The blows rained down on Tim, who was caught completely off guard, unable to defend himself effectively against the sudden assault. Amanda watched in horror as the man she cared about was beaten. The evening had descended into chaos and violence in a matter of seconds. But Hammond was not satisfied with simply beating Tim. As the assault continued, Hammond and Heidi began to discuss what to do next. The conversation that followed revealed the true depths of their depravity. Hammond stated clearly that there could not be any witnesses to what had just occurred. Both Amanda and Tim, he declared, would have to die. Heidi, rather than attempting to de-escalate the situation or call for help, agreed with this assessment and even mentioned that she knew people in Indianapolis who could dispose of a body. What followed were hours that Heidi and Hammond bound Tim's wrists and ankles with duct tape, immobilizing him completely. They covered his face with duct tape as well, cutting off his ability to breathe freely or call for help. Then, in an act that demonstrated the calculated cruelty of their actions, they turned the torture of Tim into what they called a game, taking turns kicking him as he lay bound and helpless on the floor. Tim tried to cry out, tried to grab at Hammond when he came close, but his resistance only led to further violence. At some point during this prolonged torture, Hammond grabbed a bungee cord or a piece of red cloth that had been placed around Tim's neck and used it to strangle him. Amanda, who did not have her glasses and could not see well, heard the sounds of struggle and knew that Tim was dying. She was powerless to stop it, herself a captive in this house of horrors, terrified that at any moment Hammond would turn his full attention to her and fulfill his promise that she too must die. But Hammond had other plans for Amanda before she died. While Tim lay dying or already dead nearby, Hammond repeatedly assaulted Amanda. The attacks went on for hours, with Heidi not only failing to intervene, but actively participating in the confinement and control of the victim. Amanda was held captive in that house, subjected to violation after violation, all while knowing that the man she loved was dead just feet away. The psychological torture of this situation, layered on top of the physical assaults, created trauma that would affect Amanda for the rest of her life. At some point during the night, another person arrived at the house on Stinson Avenue. A woman named Cynthia Weinsapfel had been hired to clean Heidi's home. She arrived expecting to perform routine housekeeping work, unaware that she was walking into the aftermath of a murder and an ongoing kidnapping. Heidi instructed Weinsapfel to clean the front of the house while she and Hammond remained in the back bedroom. Weinsapfel noticed things that seemed off, details that did not quite add up, but she could not have imagined the full scope of what was happening behind the closed door at the back of the house. While Weinsapfel worked in the front rooms, Heidi and Hammond went about the grim business of dealing with Tim's body. They wrapped his corpse in blankets and dragged it from the bedroom into the dining room. At one point, Heidi left the house to purchase cigarettes and food, maintaining a facade of normalcy, even as a dead body lay wrapped in blankets in her dining room and a woman remained imprisoned in her bedroom. For Amanda, the hours stretched into an eternity. She had no way of knowing if anyone would come to help her, if anyone even knew she was missing. She was alone with people who had already murdered once and had explicitly stated their intention to kill her as well. Every sound, every movement could have been the moment when they decided to finish what they had started. But outside the house on Stinson Avenue, people had begun to notice that something was wrong. Law enforcement received information that led them to the residence on October 19th. When Evansville Police Department officers arrived at the scene, they approached with caution, knowing they were potentially dealing with a dangerous situation. As officers positioned themselves around the property, Kerry Hammond emerged from the house. In his hands, he clutched an object that appeared to officers to be a firearm. In the tense seconds that followed, with officers commanding Hammond to drop the weapon and surrender, Hammond failed to comply. The officers, believing they were facing an armed and dangerous suspect, opened fire. Hammond was shot and killed. When officers entered the house after the shooting, they found Amanda Sieb. She was immediately transported to a hospital for medical treatment and evaluation. The officers also found what Heidi and Hammond had been trying to conceal. In the area of the house near where they had referenced the Christmas tree, investigators discovered Tim's body. The initial examination of the scene made clear that whatever had happened to Tim, it had been brutal and prolonged. The subsequent autopsy performed by forensic pathologist Dr. James Jacoby revealed the full extent of the violence inflicted upon Timothy Ivy. Dr. Jacoby determined that Tim had suffered multiple forms of trauma. There was evidence of manual strangulation, with bruises on his neck consistent with someone choking him with their hands. There was also evidence of ligature strangulation, with crease marks on his neck indicating that something had been tightened around his throat. Finally, there was evidence of suffocation, as Tim's face had been completely encased in duct tape. Dr. Jacoby could not definitively determine which of these three mechanisms had ultimately caused Tim's death, but it was clear that any one of them could have been fatal. Tim had died from a combination of being beaten, strangled, and suffocated while bound and helpless. The investigation also revealed the twisted nature of what Hammond had been holding when police shot him. It was not actually a gun, but rather a selfie stick that had been twisted and shaped to resemble a firearm. Investigators concluded that Hammond, knowing he would face murder charges and likely spend the rest of his life in prison, had intentionally created the appearance of being armed to provoke police into shooting him. It was what law enforcement officials call suicide by cop, a final act of violence turned inward after a night of directing violence at others. Heidi Carter was arrested and taken to the Evansville Police Department for questioning. During a 2-hour interview with detectives, Carter initially denied participating in the crimes perpetrated against Amanda and Tim. She attempted to distance herself from the violence, suggesting that Hammond had acted alone and that she had been powerless to stop him. She told detectives that Hammond had said from the beginning there could not be any witnesses and that both Amanda and Tim had to die. When asked why she had not called 911 when she left the house to buy cigarettes and food, Carter claimed she had been afraid Hammond would kill everyone. But as investigators gathered evidence, including digital communications and forensic evidence from the house, a different picture emerged. This was not a case of an innocent bystander caught up in her boyfriend's violence. Heidi Carter had been an active participant in the torture, murder, and physical assault that occurred in her home. She had helped bind Tim with duct tape. She had participated in the kicking that they had turned into a game. She had been present during the sexual assaults on Amanda and had done nothing to stop them or help the victim escape. Her claims of being a victim herself rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. Heidi Kathleen Carter was charged with multiple serious offenses: aiding, inducing, or causing murder, a level 1 felony; 2 counts of aiding, inducing, or causing rape, also level 1 felonies; and 3 counts of criminal confinement, level 3 felonies. The state of Indiana moved forward with prosecuting Carter, determined to hold her accountable for her role in the horrific events of October 19, 2021. The first trial began on November 28, 2022, in Vanderburg Circuit Court. Over 3 days, the jury heard testimony about the events of that night, including Amanda Sieb's heartbreaking account of what she had endured. The jury also heard about the evidence found at the scene and the autopsy findings regarding Tim's death. But when deliberations concluded, the jury returned a mixed verdict. They convicted Carter on a Class A misdemeanor charge of carrying a handgun without a license, but were unable to reach unanimous verdicts on the more serious charges. The trial ended without resolution on the murder, rape, and confinement charges. The prosecution, unwilling to let the case end in such an unsatisfying manner, pursued a second trial. This time, they would present additional evidence and testimony to ensure the jury understood the full scope of Carter's involvement. The second trial took place over 3 days in February 2023. Once again, Amanda Sieb took the stand and recounted the nightmare she had lived through. Tim's family members also testified, describing the man they had loved and lost and the devastating impact his murder had had on their lives. On February 15, 2023, after hearing all the evidence, the jury returned with their verdict. This time, they found Heidi Kathleen Carter guilty on all 6 counts. She was convicted of aiding, inducing, or causing murder, 2 counts of aiding, inducing, or causing rape, and 3 counts of criminal confinement. The courtroom was filled with Tim's family members and supporters, who had waited more than a year for justice. The guilty verdict was a moment of relief, though it could never undo the horror of what had happened. On March 16, 2023, almost exactly 1 month after her conviction, Heidi Carter appeared before Vanderburg County Circuit Court Judge David Keeley for sentencing. The hearing was emotional and charged with tension. Tim's family members addressed the court, asking for a lengthy sentence that would reflect the gravity of Carter's crimes. Tim's ex-wife, Jamie Combs, spoke about how Tim had been a loving father to their children and how the trauma of losing him had taken an immense toll on the entire family. Their daughter, who was 24 years old, submitted a letter describing the ongoing pain of losing the one person in the world she had been closest to. Amanda Sieb also testified at the sentencing hearing. She told the court that her life had been completely destroyed by what happened on October 19, 2021. She explained that she did not have anything close to any kind of normal life anymore, that the physical and psychological scars from that night would be with her forever. Her courage in speaking publicly about what she had endured was remarkable, given the intimate and traumatic nature of the assaults she had suffered. For her part, Heidi Carter addressed the court with a statement that seemed to indicate she still did not fully grasp or accept responsibility for what she had done. She said, "Yes, I was living in sin, but did I commit any crimes? No. Under the circumstances, I did the best that I could. I'm a victim, too." It was a statement that seemed to ignore the mountain of evidence that had led to her conviction and the testimony of the woman who had actually been victimized. Judge David Keeley was unmoved by Carter's claims of innocence. Before announcing the sentence, he noted the defendant's lack of concern that a human life had been lost. He pointed to the sadistic nature of the crimes and the deliberate choices Carter had made throughout that terrible night. The prosecutor who had tried the case, Stan Levko, had told the press that the murder and rape were among the most sadistic, if not the most sadistic, he had ever prosecuted in his career. Judge Keeley sentenced Heidi Kathleen Carter to 65 years in a state prison. The sentence consisted of time for the murder charge, time for the rape charges, and time for the confinement charges. She would also receive credit for 505 days she had already served in the county jail while awaiting trial. Carter indicated she would appeal her conviction, and the court appointed an appellate attorney at taxpayer expense due to her lack of funds. But for Tim's family and for Amanda, the sentencing represented a measure of closure, a recognition by the justice system that what had been done to Tim and Amanda was unconscionable and deserved severe punishment. Timothy Scott Ivey had been born on May 18, 1971, in Evansville, Indiana. For 50 years, he had lived a life that touched the people around him with love and kindness. He had raised children who adored him and had found love again with Amanda. On October 19, 2021, his life was taken from him in a senseless act of violence perpetrated by people he had just met, people who transformed a social encounter into a torture chamber. He died bound and helpless, unable to defend himself or escape, his final hours filled with pain and terror. For Amanda Sieb, survival came at an unimaginable cost. She would carry the physical and psychological scars of that night for the rest of her life. But she had also demonstrated remarkable courage in testifying against Carter and ensuring that justice was served. Her decision to speak publicly about what had happened to her and to allow her name to be used in news reports was an act of bravery, a refusal to let shame silence her story. The case sent shockwaves through Evansville and beyond. It served as a grim reminder of the potential dangers lurking behind online connections and the importance of caution when meeting strangers. It also highlighted the capacity for human cruelty, the way that violence can erupt without warning and consume innocent people who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it demonstrated the resilience of survivors like Amanda and the families like Tim's, who must find a way to continue living after experiencing profound loss and trauma. Heidi Carter remains incarcerated in an Indiana state prison, serving her 65-year sentence. Tim Ivey's family continues to mourn his loss, finding what comfort they can in the knowledge that his killer was held accountable. And Amanda Sieb works each day to rebuild a life that was shattered on an October night when she walked through a door expecting to meet new friends and instead encountered evil. Story 5. The sun dipped below the horizon on April 3, 2013, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of Deltona, Florida. In this peaceful suburban neighborhood of Volusia County, where families knew their neighbors and children played in front yards, no one could have imagined the horror that would unfold that evening. Across the street from each other on Horseshoe Terrace lived two neighbors whose lives had become increasingly entangled in the months leading up to that fateful night. One was James Schaefer, a 36-year-old limousine driver whose friendly demeanor made him well-liked in the community despite his struggles with disability. The other was Angela Stalt, a 41-year-old mother of two, who went by the nickname Angel among friends and family. By the time the sun rose the next morning, one of them would be dead, and the other would set in motion a series of events so disturbing that they would shock even seasoned investigators. James Schaefer lived a quiet life in his home on Horseshoe Terrace. The limo driver, who weighed well over 200 pounds, had been receiving Social Security disability benefits that helped him make ends meet. He was a man who kept to himself for the most part, but he was known in the neighborhood as someone who wouldn't cause trouble. His relationship with his neighbor Angela Stalt had begun innocuously enough, a friendship born of proximity and circumstance. Law enforcement officials would later describe their relationship as platonic, though it had evolved into something more complicated than simple neighborly kindness. In October 2012, several months before that April evening, Angela Stalt had agreed to become the payee for James Schaefer's Social Security disability benefits. The arrangement seemed straightforward. Schaefer would receive his monthly payments of $1,230, and Stalt would receive $100 for managing the account. It was meant to be a simple favor, perhaps born out of Schaefer's difficulty managing his own finances. But from the very first month, problems emerged. Schaefer kept overdrawing the account, creating financial strain that would only worsen as the months passed. Angela Stalt's own life was in a state of transition. She was separated from her husband and had a boyfriend living in Texas, though she remained in Florida with her 2 teenage children, a 16-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old son. The house they shared was a cluttered space, messy enough that investigators who later visited would discuss the possibility of contacting Child Protective Services. In this chaotic domestic environment, the financial pressures mounting from Schaefer's repeated overdrafts became an increasingly heavy burden. What had started as a neighborly arrangement began to feel like a trap from which Stalt saw no easy escape. As winter turned to spring in 2013, the tension simmered beneath the surface of everyday life on Horseshoe Terrace. On the afternoon of April 3rd, Angela Stalt made a trip to Walmart. Security footage and receipts would later show that she purchased rubber gloves and plastic wrap, items that would take on sinister significance in the hours to come. These were not random purchases made on impulse. They were deliberate acquisitions gathered with purpose, though what exactly was going through Stalt's mind at that moment remains known only to her. That evening, Stalt picked up James Schaefer from work. It was not unusual for her to give him rides. Their homes were across the street from each other, and such favors were part of their established routine. But this ride would be different from all the others. She prepared alcoholic drinks for Schaefer, spiking them with a prescription muscle relaxant. She would later tell her daughter about drugging his drink, and she would tell her sister that Schaefer was out of it when she killed him. The muscle relaxant began to take effect as they drove through the darkening Florida evening, the car heading not toward home, but to a destination that Schaefer, in his increasingly impaired state, may not have fully registered. The Osteen Cemetery lies quiet and isolated, a place where the living come to remember the dead among weathered headstones and ancient oak trees. It was to this cemetery that Angela Stalt drove James Schaefer that night. She parked her Saturn sedan beneath the spreading branches of an oak tree, the darkness of the cemetery enveloping them completely. In her purse or somewhere within reach was an ice pick, a tool she had purchased along with a second one while stocking up for a planned family camping trip. Both ice picks had been kept in her kitchen drawer. What happened next in that cemetery parking lot would be recounted later in Stalt's own voice during a recorded confession to Volusia County Sheriff's Office investigators. In her initial telling, she claimed that Schaefer attacked her and that she acted in self-defense. But the physical evidence and her own descriptions would paint a different picture. She stabbed Schaefer in one eye with the ice pick. Then, as he struggled, she strangled him. Finally, she stabbed him in the other eye. When investigators later asked whether Schaefer went unconscious immediately, Stalt's response was chilling. No, he didn't go unconscious right away, he kept coming at me. The life drained from James Schaefer beneath that oak tree in Osteen Cemetery. But Angela Stalt's night had only just begun. She wrapped Schaefer's head in plastic wrap, the same plastic wrap she had purchased at Walmart hours earlier, to prevent him from bleeding in her car. Then she drove back toward Deltona with the ice pick still embedded in his eye, the body of her neighbor slumped in her vehicle. The drive through the dark Florida night must have been surreal, each passing streetlight illuminating the reality of what she had done and the impossible situation she now faced. When Stalt arrived home, she pulled into her garage and faced the daunting task before her. James Schaefer weighed well over 285 pounds, and she was alone. With tremendous effort, she pushed his body out of the car and into a baby pool that she had placed in the garage. But disposing of the body was not going to be simple. In her garage, surrounded by the detritus of everyday family life, Angela Stalt made a decision that would define the case as one of the most disturbing crimes in Florida's recent history. She retrieved a hacksaw and began the grim work of dismembering James Schaefer's body, placing these body parts in one baby pool while leaving his torso in another. The garage floor became stained with blood, evidence that her teenage children would soon notice and question. With the body dismembered, Stalt turned to the problem of disposal. She conceived a plan that, in its macabre logic, might allow her to eliminate the evidence entirely. She brought portions of Schaefer's body into her kitchen. She attempted to cremate the remains through heat, perhaps believing that she could reduce the body to ash, or at least to something unrecognizable. The smell that filled the house was overwhelming, unlike anything Stalt had ever encountered. "The worst thing I've ever smelled in my life," she would later told. Her teenage daughter and son, who were home during this horrific process, noticed the terrible odor. When they asked their mother about it, she told them to go outside. But outside offered no escape from the evidence of the crime. Sheriff's deputies were already in the neighborhood, having begun searching for James Schaefer after he was reported missing from his home across the street. "If you had walked just a little bit over to my house, you would have smelled it," Stalt told investigators. Her children also noticed the blood on the garage floor. Thinking quickly, Stalt told them it was from a deer she had hit with her car. Then, needing help to dispose of the evidence, she enlisted her teenagers without revealing the full truth. She told them the plastic trash bags in the garage contained the deer, and asked them to help her drive around and dispose of it. One can only imagine the psychological burden these young people would carry once they learned the truth about what they had helped their mother discard. When the cremation attempt failed, and the smell became unbearable, Stalt abandoned that approach. She bagged the remaining body parts in plastic trash bags and threw them out with the trash. It was a desperate final act, a hope that the normal machinery of waste disposal would remove the evidence of her crime. But such a plan was doomed from the start. The discovery of human remains would trigger a massive investigation, and all eyes would turn to the missing man's neighbor across the street. For 2 weeks after James Schaefer's disappearance, Volusia County Sheriff's Office investigator John Brady stopped by Angela Stalt's house every morning to talk to her. She maintained her composure, allowing investigators into her home on at least one occasion. The house was messy, the floors lacking carpet, but investigators noted nothing unusual beyond the state of disarray. The ammonia that Stalt had purchased in large quantities around the time of the slaying had done its work, potentially removing blood evidence that might otherwise have been immediately apparent. But investigators were patient and thorough. As they pieced together the timeline of Schaefer's disappearance and Stalt's movements, inconsistencies emerged. Her statements didn't align with the evidence. Eventually, confronted with the mounting case against her, Angela Stalt gave a recorded confession to investigators. During that interview, her emotions shattered her sentences as she seemed to cry, worried about losing her children and lamenting that the life she had was over. In November 2014, a grand jury in Daytona Beach upgraded Angela Stalt's charges from second-degree murder to first-degree murder. The distinction was crucial. First-degree murder requires premeditation, a deliberate intent to kill that is formed before the act. The prosecution would argue that the rubber gloves and plastic wrap purchased hours before the killing, the spiked drinks, the isolated cemetery location, and the subsequent dismemberment and attempted cremation all pointed to a planned murder rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The trial took place in December 2014 in the courtroom of Circuit Judge Randall H. Row 3 in DeLand, Florida. A jury of 9 men and 5 women, including 2 alternates, listened to days of testimony that painted a vivid and disturbing picture of the crime. They heard Stalt's recorded confession played in the courtroom, her voice filling the space with details that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The jurors followed along with transcripts, their heads usually turned down at the papers in front of them, one occasionally sipping coffee as they absorbed the horrific narrative. Angela Stalt sat composed throughout the trial, dressed in black slacks and a dark sweater, occasionally brushing back her long brown hair. She displayed no emotion as her recorded voice described cutting up her neighbor and attempting to cook his remains. During breaks, she was observed laughing softly as she spoke with her attorney, Assistant Public Defender Jim Ballerino. The contrast between her courtroom composure and the emotional breakdown evident in her recorded confession was stark and unsettling. Stalt took the stand in her own defense. Dressed in black pants and a blue, sparkly blouse, She testified that James Schaefer had attacked her in the cemetery and that she had killed him in self-defense. But Assistant State Attorney Heather Trigones systematically dismantled that defense. She pointed to the premeditation evidenced by the Walmart purchases. She highlighted the fact that Stalt had spiked Schaefer's drink with muscle relaxants, hardly the act of someone expecting to be attacked. She emphasized the wrapping of Schaefer's head in plastic wrap to prevent bleeding, showing consciousness of guilt and planning. Trigones also brought up an unusual detail that spoke to Stalt's capacity for the gruesome task she had undertaken. Stalt had mentioned in her statements that she used an ice pick to stab fish because she didn't like touching them. Really? Trigones asked the jury. She doesn't like touching fish, but she manages to dismember a 285-pound human man and cook him, and then clean him, and then put him into trash bags. It was a devastating point that highlighted the calculated nature of Stalt's actions after the killing. Stalt's defense attorney conceded that his client was guilty of abusing a dead human body and tampering with evidence, but he argued there was no evidence to support the first-degree murder charge. Without witnesses to the actual killing besides Stalt herself, her daughter, and her sister who had been told different versions of events, he suggested reasonable doubt should prevail on the question of premeditation. But the jury was unconvinced. After nearly 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Angela Stalt showed no emotion as the clerk read guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. She remained impassive as the guilty verdicts were read for abuse of a dead human body and tampering with physical evidence. A bailiff approached with handcuffs, the metallic clicking echoing in the silent courtroom as he locked them on Stalt's wrists. On December 5, 2014, Circuit Judge Randall H. Row 3 sentenced Angela Stalt to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as required by law for first-degree murder convictions. He also sentenced her to 15 years for abusing a dead human body, to be served after the life sentence, and another 5 years for tampering with physical evidence, to follow the body abuse charge. It was a sentence that ensured Angela Stalt would never again walk free, that she would spend the remainder of her days behind bars, perhaps reflecting on the April night when financial pressures and whatever darkness resided within her had led to the unthinkable. The case of Angela Stalt and James Schaefer stands as a grim reminder that the most horrifying crimes can occur in the most ordinary places. On a quiet street in suburban Florida, where neighbors waved to each other and children rode bicycles, a relationship that began with a simple financial arrangement descended into murder and mutilation. The teenagers who helped dispose of what they thought was a deer would have to live with the knowledge of what they had unwittingly participated in. The community that had felt safe would have to reconcile with the reality that such evil had existed in their midst. For James Schaefer, a man who struggled with disability and relied on the kindness of others, his trust in a neighbor proved fatal. He could not have known, as he accepted those spiked drinks and rode in that car toward Osteen Cemetery, that his life was about to end. And for Angela Stalt, the woman who called herself Angel, the desperate attempt to solve a financial problem through violence only created a nightmare from which there could be no awakening, only the cold reality of a prison cell and the weight of what she had done. Story 6. The September evening air hung heavy over Tecumseh, Michigan, carrying with it the last whispers of summer warmth as Friday the 14th arrived in 2018. In a modest home on North Maumee Street, a tragedy was about to unfold that would shatter 2 families and expose the dark secrets hiding beneath the surface of what appeared to be an ordinary American household. Amy Allen was 34 years old, a quiet woman with a gentle demeanor who had moved to this small Michigan town just a year earlier with her husband James, who preferred to go by Jimmy, and their teenage daughter Ashley. Those who knew Amy described her as shy and reserved, someone who seemed to retreat into herself rather than command attention in a room. She had been a stay-at-home mother and wife for years, dedicated to caring for her family, while her husband worked as a video production specialist for an automotive accessories company in nearby Ann Arbor. The family had relocated from Ocala, Florida, where Amy had deep roots and close connections to her mother Jean Winchester and the rest of her family. The move to Michigan had been difficult for Amy, pulling her away from the support system she had known all her life and dropping her into an unfamiliar landscape where the approaching winters felt as cold and isolating as her new existence. That Friday evening began like many others, with a decision that seemed innocuous at the time. Jimmy and Amy dropped their 15-year-old daughter Ashley at the Tecumseh High School football game before heading out to grab dinner and drinks together. They started at Ember's Bar and Grill before moving on to JR's Hometown Grill and Pub, two local establishments where the couple could sit together and perhaps bridge the growing distance that seemed to separate them. But the evening did not unfold as a romantic reconnection between husband and wife. Instead, tension crackled between them like electricity before a storm. Jimmy had been talking about selling their Michigan home and moving again, possibly to North Carolina, uprooting their lives once more after barely settling into Tecumseh. When he broached the subject with Amy at the bar, her response was pointed and cold, revealing the fractures in their relationship. She told him plainly that she hoped his plan worked out for him, the implication clear that she had no intention of following him on yet another relocation. The argument that began in the bar continued to simmer as the evening wore on, two people sitting across from each other, but existing in completely separate worlds. What Jimmy did not know was that Amy had been carrying her own secret, one that represented an escape from the confines of her carefully controlled life. For 3 years, she had been engaged in an online relationship with a man named George who lived on the East Coast. Their connection had begun as messages exchanged across digital space, but had evolved into something deeper and more significant. They had met in person on a couple of occasions, and George represented to Amy a version of herself that felt alive and valued. When she communicated with George, she transformed into a completely different person, positive and engaged rather than withdrawn and quiet. Even that evening at the bar, while sitting across from her husband during what would be their final argument, Amy had been texting with George, maintaining that secret connection that offered her something Jimmy no longer provided. The couple left the bar just before 8 o'clock in the evening, but they did not leave together. Jimmy got into his car and drove the short distance home, while Amy chose to walk, perhaps needing the cool evening air and the solitude of the journey to clear her head from the tension of the evening. A security camera captured her image at 7:51 that evening, walking alone down the street toward the house on North Maumee Street. She would arrive home shortly after, stepping through the door and into the last moments of her life. According to Jimmy's later account to police, he arrived home first and turned on the television at 8 o'clock. Amy came in shortly after and went down to the basement, an unfinished space beneath their house where the family kept various items and where their cat often wandered. When Jimmy went to check on why she had gone downstairs, he said she was petting the cat, and that was when she began swearing at him, the argument from the bar reigniting in the confined space of their home. Less than 40 minutes after Amy had walked through the front door, Jimmy would dial 911 in what he claimed was a desperate response to a horrifying discovery. The emergency call came through at 8:39 that evening, Jimmy's voice frantic as he told the dispatcher that his wife had tried to kill herself and was in the basement. He reported finding Amy hanging from an extension cord attached to a hook in the basement ceiling, her body suspended in what he insisted was a suicide attempt. Jimmy told the dispatcher he was performing CPR, trying desperately to revive his unresponsive wife as he waited for help to arrive. When first responders rushed into that basement, they found a scene that immediately triggered their professional instincts and raised troubling questions. Amy was still in the basement, the orange extension cord wrapped around her neck with a slip knot at one end and another knot tied where it would have been attached to a hook screwed into a joist in the low basement ceiling. But several details struck the paramedics and police officers as inconsistent with a typical hanging. The knots in the cord were not as tight as they would have expected from the weight of a body suspended in a hanging. The basement ceiling was extraordinarily low, raising questions about how Amy could have successfully hanged herself in such a confined space. Most troubling of all, There was little to no obvious trauma visible on Amy's neck, no deep ligature marks that would typically be expected when a cord had borne the full weight of a person's body during a hanging. The paramedics worked quickly, managing to restore a faint pulse despite Amy's dire condition. She was rushed to Pramadika Harak Hospital in Tecumseh, where the emergency department staff continued their efforts to stabilize her. The doctors and nurses at Harak shared the same concerns as the first responders, noting that the tightness of the knot around Amy's neck and the nature of her injuries did not seem consistent with a typical hanging suicide. Her condition was critical, and she was soon airlifted to the University of Michigan Hospital in Ann Arbor, where specialized care might offer her a chance at survival. But Amy never regained consciousness. She lay in the hospital for 3 days, her brain irreparably damaged from oxygen deprivation, while her family rushed to reach her bedside. What made the situation even more painful for Amy's loved ones was that they had not been immediately notified of her condition. Jimmy's father had informed them that Amy was already dead when in fact she was still on life support, clinging to life for nearly 14 hours before her family even knew what had happened. When Jean Winchester and the rest of Amy's family finally arrived at the hospital, they had only minutes to say their goodbyes before Amy was taken off life support and allowed to die. She passed away on September 17th, 3 days after that terrible evening in the basement, never having opened her eyes or spoken another word. The medical examiner's autopsy determined that Amy had died from asphyxiation, a finding that was not disputed. However, the manner of death was initially listed as undetermined pending further investigation, because the evidence did not clearly point to either suicide or homicide. Washtenaw County's medical examiner conducted the initial autopsy and noticed something significant. Amy had suffered a fracture to the tip of her thyroid cartilage in her neck. This type of injury could occur from pressure applied to the neck, but the actual cause of this specific fracture could not be definitively determined. A second forensic pathologist reviewed the case and concluded that Amy's death was likely a homicide, though he acknowledged it was a difficult determination to make given the complexities of the available information. The Tecumseh police began investigating Amy's death, conducting interviews and gathering evidence. After a month, they asked the Michigan State Police to take over the investigation, recognizing that the case required additional resources and expertise. Detectives began to piece together a more complete picture of Amy's life and her relationship with Jimmy, and what they discovered painted a troubling portrait of control and manipulation. Investigators learned that Jimmy had been extremely controlling throughout his marriage to Amy, a pattern that had intensified over the years. He had access to Amy's cell phone and monitored her communications, limiting her use of social media and even restricting how she spent her time, including playing video games. He kept close tabs on what his family ate and where they went, creating an environment where Amy had to check with him before making even simple decisions like going to lunch with her own mother. Jean Winchester would later reflect that she believed Jimmy had deliberately kept Amy from entering the workforce, wanting her to remain at home where he could maintain control over her life. Witnesses who knew the couple described Amy as someone who seemed to shrink into herself, quiet and withdrawn, living under the weight of her husband's domination. The evidence of Jimmy's controlling nature extended beyond his relationship with Amy. Amy's son from a previous relationship, Caleb Winchester, testified about a disturbing incident that had occurred when he was in high school. During an argument, Jimmy had become angry with Caleb and put the teenager in a chokehold, using his arm to compress Caleb's neck until the young man was restrained and subdued. The incident had been frightening enough that Caleb eventually moved out of the house to live with his maternal grandparents, choosing to remove himself from Jimmy's household rather than continue living under the same roof. Detectives also discovered that Jimmy had engaged in 2 extramarital affairs during his marriage to Amy, betrayals that added another layer of complexity to their relationship. While Jimmy had been stepping outside his marriage, Amy had sought connection elsewhere as well, finding in George an outlet for feelings and aspects of herself that she could not express in her controlled home life. The investigation revealed that Amy had even made plans to meet George in person the following month, in October 2018, a future meeting that would never take place. Her electronic communications showed a woman who was making plans for the future, thinking about vacations and holidays and meals to come, not someone on the verge of taking her own life. As the investigation progressed, detectives examined the physical evidence more closely. They brought in a materials scientist and chemist named Elizabeth Buck to test the extension cord that had been found around Amy's neck. Buck conducted experiments with similar cords, subjecting them to the weight that would be expected during a hanging. Her findings were significant. When subjected to Amy's weight of 140 pounds, the cords would either elongate or break entirely, and the knots at both the hook and the neck would have become extremely tight. Yet the cord found around Amy's neck had shown none of these characteristics, suggesting it had not actually borne the full weight of her body in a typical hanging scenario. 2 years after Amy's death, in 2020, the Lenawee County Prosecutor's Office filed an open murder charge against James David Allen. He was arrested in Ocala, Florida, where he had returned to live with his parents within a week of Amy's death, taking their daughter Ashley with him. Jimmy had been adamant from the beginning that he was innocent, insisting that Amy had tragically taken her own life and that he had nothing to do with her death. He had cooperated with police throughout their investigation, providing statements and evidence that he believed demonstrated his innocence. The trial began in September 2021, more than 3 years after that terrible evening in the basement. Over the course of almost 2 weeks, jurors heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, each contributing pieces to the puzzle of what had happened to Amy Allen. First responders described their suspicions when they arrived at the scene and found the inconsistencies in the physical evidence. Medical personnel from both Herrick Hospital and the University of Michigan Hospital testified about their observations and concerns. 3 different forensic pathologists took the stand, each offering their own interpretation of the evidence, and remarkably reaching different conclusions about whether Amy's death was a suicide or a homicide. The prosecution presented a theory of what had happened in that basement on September 14th. They argued that when Jimmy and Amy returned home from the bar, the argument that had started earlier in the evening had continued and escalated. Amy, perhaps emboldened by her secret relationship with George, or simply exhausted from years of control, had stood up for herself in a way that Jimmy was not accustomed to tolerating. In the basement of their home, the prosecutors theorized, Jimmy had approached Amy from behind and wrapped his arm around her neck in what is known as a rear naked choke hold, a technique that compresses the carotid arteries and can render a person unconscious within seconds. Once Amy had lost consciousness, Jimmy had then strangled her with the extension cord and staged the scene to make it appear that she had hanged herself, creating the appearance of a suicide to cover his actions. The defense mounted a vigorous challenge to this theory, arguing that Amy had indeed taken her own life. They emphasized that Amy had been drinking that evening and had a blood alcohol content of 0.09 when she arrived at Herrick Hospital, suggesting that alcohol might have impaired her judgment and contributed to a decision to attempt suicide. Defense attorneys highlighted that the initial medical examiner had been unable to definitively rule Amy's death a homicide, listing the manner of death as undetermined. They had planned to present testimony from Dr. Francisco Diaz, a highly respected forensic pathologist and chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, who had reviewed all the evidence and concluded that Amy's death was most consistent with a low suspension, hanging by suicide rather than a homicide. However, Dr. Diaz suffered a medical emergency the night before he was scheduled to testify and was hospitalized, unable to appear in court. Instead, his opinion letter was read to the jury, providing his expert assessment that the evidence pointed to suicide. Jimmy did not testify at his own trial, a decision that is every defendant's right, but one that always leaves questions hanging in the air. His daughter Ashley, who was 15 at the time of her mother's death, testified on behalf of her father, supporting his claim that Amy had taken her own life. The family dynamics were heartbreaking, with Ashley standing by her father, even as Amy's own family sat on the other side of the courtroom, convinced that Jimmy had murdered their beloved daughter and sister. The jury began their deliberations after attorneys finished their closing arguments, tasked with deciding whether Jimmy Allen was guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, second-degree murder, or not guilty. They deliberated for about an hour and a half on the first day before being sent home for the evening. The following day, after almost 6 hours of total deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom at approximately 2:20 in the afternoon on September 24, 2021. They had reached a verdict. James David Allen was guilty of second-degree murder in the death of his wife Amy. The conviction meant that the jury had found that Jimmy had intentionally killed Amy, but had not premeditated the murder, suggesting they believed he had acted in the heat of the moment during their argument rather than planning her death in advance. On October 21, 2021, Circuit Judge Michael R. Alsaver sentenced Jimmy Allen to 20 to 45 years in prison, a sentence that would allow for the possibility of parole, but ensured he would spend decades behind bars. As the sentence was handed down, the two families sat in the courtroom with vastly different emotions washing over them. For Amy's mother, Jean Winchester, there was a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. She told reporters that it felt like they had finally gotten justice for Amy, that her daughter finally had a voice after being silenced in that basement. But she was also acutely aware that there were no true winners in this tragedy, that both families had been shattered beyond repair. Their family was broken, grieving the loss of Amy and the years they would never have with her. Jimmy's family was broken too, with a father in prison and a daughter who had lost both parents in one terrible evening. Jimmy Allen appealed his conviction, arguing that he had been denied effective assistance of counsel and that he should be granted a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. He maintained that Dr. Diaz's inability to testify in person had deprived him of his right to present a complete defense, and that additional testimony from Dr. Diaz about other possible causes of Amy's thyroid cartilage fracture constituted new evidence that could change the outcome. In April 2024, the Michigan Court of Appeals reviewed his arguments and affirmed his conviction, finding that his trial counsel had acted reasonably under difficult circumstances and that the evidence did not warrant a new trial. The case of Amy Allen remains a tragedy that touches everyone who learns about it. It is the story of a woman who seemed trapped in a life she could not escape, controlled by a husband who monitored her every move and dictated her existence. It is the story of secrets kept in the digital shadows, of an online relationship that offered Amy a glimpse of who she might have been in different circumstances. It is the story of an argument in a bar that escalated into violence, of a basement where a life ended and a family was destroyed. Most of all, it is a reminder that behind closed doors, in homes that look ordinary from the outside, people can be suffering in ways that remain invisible until it is too late. Amy's family continues to carry the weight of her loss, remembering the quiet, shy woman who deserved so much more than the life she was given and the death she suffered. They remember the daughter, the mother, the sister who was taken from them on that September evening in 2018. And they hold on to the knowledge that after years of investigation and a lengthy trial, a jury looked at the evidence and decided that Amy did not take her own life, that someone took it from her in an act of violence that he then tried to disguise as tragedy. In the end, justice may have been served with Jimmy Allen's conviction and imprisonment, but nothing can bring Amy back or restore what was lost on that autumn night in Tecumseh, Michigan. Her story stands as a testament to the importance of seeing the signs of control and abuse before they escalate into violence, and to the courage it takes to break free from relationships that suffocate rather than sustain. Story 7. The morning of March 17, 2020, arrived in Derry, New Hampshire with the quiet ordinariness that marks the beginning of most tragedies. St. Patrick's Day carried its usual promise of celebration across America, but for Amanda Grzuski, a 23-year-old woman staying with a friend on Birch Street, this day would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt her family for years. As the world prepared to plunge into the uncertainty of a global pandemic, one young woman slipped away from a modest home in this small New Hampshire town, leaving behind her belongings, her phone, her purse, and every trace of the life she had been building. Amanda left her friend's house that day in circumstances that would later seem almost impossible to understand. How does a person simply walk away from everything they own? The question would torment investigators and family members alike as days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Her mother, Jessica Grzuski, would later describe her daughter as someone with good intentions, a woman whose laugh could light up a room, a sister, a mother herself, someone with remarkable strength. But on that March morning, Amanda walked out into the world without the tools modern life demands. No phone to call for help, no identification to prove who she was, no money to buy food or shelter. The Birch Street area where Amanda was last seen sits in a quiet corner of Derry, a town of roughly 33,000 people located in the southeastern part of New Hampshire, not far from the Massachusetts border. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where children play on tree-lined streets, and where disappearances aren't supposed to happen. Yet Amanda vanished as completely as if she had stepped through a door into another dimension. The friend's home at the corner of Birch and Grove Streets would become ground zero for an investigation that would consume countless hours of police work, generate numerous tips from concerned citizens, and leave a family suspended in the agonizing space between hope and despair. As March 2020 progressed, the world transformed around Amanda's disappearance. The coronavirus pandemic swept across the globe, lockdowns began, and the normal rhythms of investigation and search were complicated by unprecedented restrictions on movement and gathering. Yet the Derry Police Department, working with the New Hampshire Attorney General's office, continued their efforts to find Amanda. They followed leads, interviewed witnesses, and tried to piece together what could have happened to a young woman who seemed to have simply evaporated into the New England air. Her family refused to give up, clinging to the possibility that somewhere, somehow, Amanda was still alive, perhaps unable to contact them, perhaps suffering from some trauma or crisis that had severed her connection to her former life. The investigation into Amanda's disappearance unfolded against the backdrop of a community trying to understand what had happened. Detectives worked tirelessly, following every possible lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. They examined her last known movements, spoke with everyone who had seen her in the days and weeks before she vanished, and tried to construct a timeline that might explain where she had gone. The fact that she had left without her belongings suggested either extreme urgency or extreme distress. Had something frightened her? Had she been running from danger? Or had something else entirely happened that March day, something that prevented her from ever returning to collect her phone and purse? The Grzuski family lived in a special kind of torment reserved for those whose loved ones vanish without explanation. Unlike the families of those who die in accidents or from illness, they had no closure, no grave to visit, no final goodbye to help them process their grief. Instead, they existed in a liminal space between loss and hope, never quite able to move forward, never quite able to let go. Jessica Grzuski spoke to reporters about her daughter's good qualities, keeping Amanda's memory alive even as the days without answers stretched into years. She remembered Amanda as a mother herself, a young woman who had brought life into the world, who had responsibilities and connections that should have kept her tethered to her community. As the first anniversary of Amanda's disappearance approached in March 2021, the case remained frustratingly cold. Police continued to field tips, but none had led to a breakthrough. The second anniversary came and went, then the third, then the fourth. Each passing year made it statistically less likely that Amanda would be found alive, but her family refused to abandon hope entirely. They hired a drone pilot, investing their own resources into the search for their missing daughter. The decision would prove to be momentous, though not in the way they had desperately hoped. The fifth anniversary of Amanda's disappearance fell in March 2025, a grim milestone that seemed to underscore the tragedy of her case. 5 years is an eternity in the life of a family torn apart by uncertainty. Children grow up, seasons change, life moves forward relentlessly even as one family remains frozen in their grief. But as that 5th year approached, something shifted in the case. The drone pilot hired by the Grzuski family was conducting aerial searches of the area around where Amanda had last been seen, methodically covering ground that had perhaps been searched before but never from this elevated perspective. On Wednesday, March 19, 2025, the drone pilot saw something near the Hoodcroft Country Club golf course in Derry. The golf course sat less than a mile from the friend's home where Amanda had been staying, close enough that she could have walked there in perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. What the drone pilot saw from above warranted immediate attention, and he contacted the Derry Police Department right away. The next day, Thursday, March 20th, police conducted a thorough search of the area based on this tip. What they found would finally answer the question of what had happened to Amanda Grzuski, though it would raise many others in the process. The remains were skeletal, suggesting they had been there for a considerable period of time. The location was near the golf course, in an area that had somehow escaped previous searches, or where the remains had been obscured by vegetation, weather, or terrain. The discovery came almost exactly 5 years after Amanda had vanished from Birch Street, a coincidence that seemed almost cruel in its timing. The remains were carefully recovered and transported to the office of the chief medical examiner, where forensic anthropologists would work to identify them definitively. The identification process involved careful scientific analysis. Forensic anthropologists, specialists in examining human skeletal remains, worked in consultation with the medical examiner's office to determine who these remains belonged to. They used various methods that might include dental records, DNA analysis, and examination of unique skeletal features to make their determination. The wait for results must have been excruciating for the Grzuski family, who had endured 5 years of not knowing and now faced the final confirmation of their worst fears. The confirmation came swiftly. The skeletal remains found near the Hoodcroft Country Club golf course were positively identified as belonging to Amanda Grzuski, the young woman who had walked away from her friend's home on March 17, 2020, had never left Derry. She had been there all along, less than a mile from where she was last seen, resting in a location that would eventually be discovered by technology deployed by her own family's determination to find answers. New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella released a statement following the identification, expressing sympathy for the Grzuski family during what he described as an incredibly difficult time. His words acknowledged not only the family's loss, but also the work of the law enforcement and forensic professionals who had labored on this case for 5 years. He also thanked community members who had provided valuable tips throughout the investigation, recognizing that solving cases like this requires cooperation between police and the public they serve. Yet even with Amanda's remains recovered and identified, fundamental questions remained unanswered. The most pressing of these was the question of how she died. The investigation into the cause and manner of Amanda's death remained ongoing as of late March 2025, with police still working to determine what had happened to her. The condition of the remains after 5 years of exposure to the elements would make this determination challenging. Forensic experts would need to examine the bones carefully for any signs of trauma, while investigators would need to consider all possible scenarios that could explain how a 23-year-old woman ended up deceased near a golf course shortly after leaving her friend's home. The proximity of the location where Amanda's remains were found to where she was last seen raised troubling possibilities. Had she met with foul play? Had she suffered some medical emergency or mental health crisis that led to her death? Had she been the victim of an accident? Each scenario carried its own terrible implications. The Derry Police Department continued to ask for public assistance, requesting that anyone with information about Amanda's disappearance and death come forward. The plea suggested that investigators believed someone out there might have knowledge that could help them understand what had happened during those missing hours or days after Amanda walked away from Birch Street. For Jessica Grzuski, the identification of her daughter's remains brought a complex mixture of emotions. After 5 years of uncertainty, she finally had an answer about Amanda's fate, but it was the answer every parent dreads. She could finally mourn her daughter properly, could finally have something resembling closure, but the questions about how and why Amanda died would continue to haunt her. In her statements to the media, Jessica focused on how she wanted Amanda to be remembered, not as a tragedy or a mystery, but as a person with warmth and humanity. She wanted people to remember Amanda's laugh, her sense of humor, her good intentions, her roles as a daughter, sister, and mother, and her strength. The case of Amanda Grzuski illustrates the profound impact that a single disappearance can have on a family and a community. For 5 years, Derry carried the weight of this unsolved mystery, with residents wondering what had happened to the young woman who had vanished from Birch Street. The discovery of her remains brought some answers, but also highlighted how close she had been all along, resting near a golf course that likely saw hundreds or thousands of people pass through it during those 5 years. The fact that it took a privately hired drone to finally locate her remains raises questions about search techniques and whether ground-level searches might have missed what aerial surveillance revealed. As the investigation continues into the cause of Amanda's death, her case serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of perseverance in seeking truth and justice. The Grzuski family's decision to hire a drone pilot demonstrated their unwillingness to give up, their determination to find answers, even after 5 years of disappointment and dead ends. That determination ultimately brought Amanda home, even if not in the way anyone would have hoped. The story also highlights the critical role that forensic science plays in modern investigations, with anthropologists and medical examiners able to extract identity and information from remains that have been exposed to years of weathering and decay. The Derry Police Department and the New Hampshire Attorney General's office continue their work to understand exactly what happened to Amanda Grzuski in March 2020. They face the challenging task of reconstructing events that occurred 5 years ago, working with physical evidence that has been degraded by time and the elements, and trying to find witnesses who might remember crucial details from half a decade in the past. But they persist because Amanda deserves justice, and her family deserves answers. The case remains open, with investigators following leads and examining evidence as they work to determine how a young woman's life ended so close to where she was last seen alive. In the end, Amanda Grzuski's story is one of loss, persistence, and the enduring love of a family that refused to stop searching. It's a story that began on an ordinary March day in 2020 and concluded with a discovery 5 years later that was both a relief and a heartbreak. It's a reminder that behind every missing person case is a human being with family who love them, a life that mattered, and a story that deserves to be told with dignity and respect. As investigators continue their work to understand how Amanda died, her mother's wish remains clear, that her daughter be remembered not for how her life ended, but for the person she was, a woman with a memorable laugh, good intentions, and the strength to face whatever challenges life brought her way. Story 8. The morning of September 21st, 1996, began like many other September mornings in Belgrade, Montana, with golden autumn light filtering through the windows of the Hutchins family home. 15-year-old Danielle Hutchins, who went by the nickname Danny to everyone who knew her, woke to what should have been just another Saturday in her young life. She was an outdoorsy teenager, the kind of girl who felt most at home in Montana's vast natural spaces, where the mountains met the sky and the rivers ran cold and clear. She had recently earned her driver's license, a milestone that gave her a taste of independence and freedom that teenagers crave. That morning, she had no way of knowing that the ordinary tensions of family life would set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy and leave a mystery unsolved for nearly 3 decades. Danny lived with her mother Cheryl, her father Rex, her brother Jake, and her younger sister Stephanie in the small town of Belgrade, just a few miles from the college town of Bozeman. It was a close-knit family, but like all families, they had their moments of friction. That Saturday morning, a disagreement erupted, the kind of spat that happens in households with teenagers navigating the complicated terrain between childhood and adulthood. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, Danny decided to leave the house. She needed to clear her head, to find some solitude where she could process her teenage emotions away from the confines of home. She climbed into her truck, a vehicle that represented her newfound independence, and drove away from Belgrade. Her destination was the Cameron Bridge fishing access, a popular spot on the Gallatin River that locals frequented for fishing, walking, and simply enjoying the beauty of Montana's wilderness. It was the kind of place where people went to find peace, where the sound of rushing water could soothe troubled thoughts. For Danny, it seemed like the perfect refuge for a few hours of reflection. When Danny failed to return home that afternoon, her family grew concerned. As the hours passed and the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, worry turned to alarm. Cheryl Hutchins, Danny's mother, decided to go look for her daughter. She drove to the Cameron Bridge fishing access, the place she suspected Danny might have gone to be alone. When Cheryl arrived at the fishing access site, her worst fears began to take shape. There, in the parking area, sat Danny's truck. The vehicle was unlocked and empty, abandoned in a way that immediately struck Cheryl as wrong. As Cheryl searched the area around the truck, she discovered items that deepened her sense of dread. A few feet away from the truck, lying in the middle of the trail, were Danny's keys and her water bottle. These were not items a person would casually discard. They suggested something sudden, something unexpected, perhaps something violent. Cheryl immediately contacted the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. As daylight faded and darkness descended over the fishing access, search parties mobilized to comb the area. Late that night, the searchers made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In a marshy area near the Cameron Bridge, in shallow water beneath a willow tree, they found Danny's body. She was lying face down, her young life extinguished in a place that should have been a sanctuary. The position of her body and other evidence at the scene told investigators that Danny had been dragged to this location, that someone had deliberately hidden her there among the reeds and mud. One of her sandals had fallen off and was found nearby. Her mother's gold elastic watch had been pulled over her hand during the struggle. Her face bore scratches and bruises that spoke of a fight, of desperate attempts to survive. Danny's body was transported to the Montana State Crime Lab for an autopsy. The examination revealed the full horror of what had happened to the 15-year-old girl. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been suffocated in the shallow water, her killer holding her face down in the mud and marsh until she could no longer breathe. The medical examiner, Gary Dale, concluded that Danny had died by drowning, though he noted that the manner of death was initially undetermined pending further investigation. Crucially, DNA evidence was collected from Danny's body, including foreign DNA that did not belong to her. This genetic material would prove to be the key to solving the case, though it would take nearly 3 decades and revolutionary advances in forensic technology before its secrets could be unlocked. The investigation into Danny's murder began immediately, but from the start, investigators faced significant challenges. There were no witnesses to the crime. The fishing access was a public place, but on that particular Saturday, no one had seen anything suspicious. Initially, some officials even suggested the possibility that Danny's death might have been an accidental drowning, despite the evidence of physical assault and the suspicious circumstances of her disappearance. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that this was a homicide, a violent crime perpetrated by someone who had encountered Danny at the river and had seen an opportunity to attack. Numerous individuals were questioned in the weeks and months following Danny's death. DNA samples were collected from potential suspects. Investigators pursued every lead, interviewed everyone who might have information, and worked tirelessly to identify the person responsible for the murder. But despite their efforts, the case went cold. The DNA evidence collected from Danny's body did not match any known offenders in the criminal justice system. Without a match, without a suspect, the investigation stalled. Years turned into decades, and still, Danny's killer remained unidentified. For Danny's family, the passage of time did nothing to ease their pain. Cheryl Hutchins, who had found her daughter's abandoned truck that terrible September day, lived with the anguish of not knowing who had taken her child's life. Stephanie Mollett, who had been just a young girl when her sister was murdered, grew into adulthood carrying the weight of that loss and the guilt of the family argument that had sent Danny out of the house that morning. The Hutchins family never gave up hope that someday, somehow, justice would be served. They trusted that the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office would never close the case, that investigators would continue searching for answers no matter how many years passed. Their faith was not misplaced. Detective Tom Elfmont, a cold case investigator who had retired from the Los Angeles Police Department and brought his expertise to Montana, took on Danny's case with determination. Elfmont understood that the key to solving the case lay in the DNA evidence that had been carefully preserved since 1996. As forensic technology advanced, new possibilities emerged for analyzing genetic material that had once been unidentifiable. Elfmont worked with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office to ensure that Danny's case would benefit from every technological breakthrough that could bring them closer to identifying her killer. In recent years, a revolutionary technique called forensic genetic genealogy had begun to transform cold case investigations across the country. This method involved taking DNA from crime scenes and uploading the genetic profile to public genealogy databases, where investigators could identify distant relatives of the suspect. By building family trees and working backward through generations, skilled genetic genealogists could narrow down the list of potential suspects until they identified the person whose DNA matched the evidence. The technique had already solved hundreds of cold cases, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office decided to employ this cutting-edge technology in Danny's case. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. The DNA profile from Danny's case was sent to Parabon, where it would be analyzed by one of the most skilled genetic genealogists in the field, Cece Moore, a woman who had gained fame for her work on cold cases. Cece Moore took on Danny's case with the meticulous attention to detail that had made her successful in solving over 300 cold cases during her career. She analyzed the DNA profile and began searching through genealogy databases for matches. The work was painstaking and required connecting distant relatives across multiple branches of family trees. Moore later explained that in forensic genetic genealogy, investigators almost always work with very distant relatives, and it is almost never just one match that leads to the suspect. As Moore built the family tree, she encountered something confounding. The relatives she was identifying all lived in New Hampshire, thousands of miles from Montana. What could possibly be the connection between a family from New England and a murder in the Montana wilderness? Moore pressed forward, searching through birth indexes, marriage certificates, and even social media profiles of the descendants she had identified. She worked her way through the family tree until she reached the youngest son of one of the family branches. When Moore examined his Facebook page, she found the answer she had been searching for. The young man had posted that he had moved to Bozeman, Montana, on July 1, 1996. The timeline was significant. July 1996 was just 2.5 months before Danny's murder. Moore had found the connection. She continued her genealogical work, building out the family tree and connecting to all 4 of the suspect's grandparents. The evidence pointed to one individual, Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson, a 55-year-old man living in Dillon, Montana. Moore's analysis indicated that hair found on Danny's body, hair that had been preserved as evidence for nearly 28 years, belonged to Paul Hutchinson. Investigators learned that in September 1996, when Danny was murdered, Paul Hutchinson had been a student at Montana State University in Bozeman, studying fisheries wildlife biology. He would have been 27 years old at the time, living in the Bozeman area, and likely familiar with local fishing access sites like Cameron Bridge. After graduating, Hutchinson had built what appeared to be a stable, respectable life. He had worked for the Montana Bureau of Land Management in Dillon for 22 years. He had married a woman named Christy and had raised 2 adult children. He had no criminal history, not even a traffic violation. To everyone who knew him, Paul Hutchinson was a family man, a government employee, an ordinary citizen. No one suspected that he harbored a terrible secret from nearly 3 decades earlier. On July 23, 2024, detectives Tom Elfmont and another investigator approached Paul Hutchinson outside his office in Beaverhead County. They asked if he would agree to be interviewed about a cold case investigation. Hutchinson, perhaps believing he had no choice but to cooperate, agreed to speak with them. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours, and during that time, Hutchinson's behavior betrayed his inner turmoil. He displayed extreme nervousness, sweating profusely despite the air conditioning. He scratched at his face repeatedly and chewed on his hand, physical manifestations of the anxiety coursing through him. When investigators showed him a photograph of Danielle Hutchins, Hutchinson slumped in his chair, his body language revealing what his words would not. Hutchinson maintained that he had no knowledge of Danny's murder, that he had never been to the Cameron Bridge fishing access on September 21, 1996. But the investigators knew better. They knew that the DNA evidence was building toward confirmation, that the forensic genetic genealogy work had led them directly to him. After the interview concluded, Hutchinson was allowed to leave. The investigators did not arrest him that day because they were still waiting for final confirmation of the DNA match. They planned to follow up with him once the results came back from the lab. But Paul Hutchinson had other plans. In the early hours of the morning on July 24th, less than 10 hours after his interview with detectives, Hutchinson called the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office at 4:17 a.m. He told the dispatcher that he needed assistance, and then he hung up. Deputies immediately responded to locate him, concerned about what kind of assistance he might need at such an early hour. They found him shortly thereafter, on the side of a road near Dillon. Paul Hutchinson was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Hutchinson's suicide confirmed what investigators had already suspected. A guilty man had chosen to end his own life rather than face the consequences of what he had done 28 years earlier. In the days following his death, the final DNA results came back from the lab. The confirmation was complete. Paul Hutchinson's DNA matched the DNA collected from Danielle Hutchins' body in 1996. There was no doubt, no margin of error. Paul Hutchinson had raped and murdered 15-year-old Danny Hutchins at the Cameron Bridge fishing access on September 21, 1996. On August 8, 2024, Gallatin County Sheriff Dan Springer held a press conference to announce that Danny's case had been solved. Investigators determined that Hutchinson and Danny had no prior connection, that they had never known each other before that September day. The murder had been what law enforcement officials call a crime of opportunity, a random encounter that turned deadly when a predator saw a vulnerable target. Danny had been alone at the fishing access, seeking solitude and time to think after the family argument that morning. Paul Hutchinson, who was likely familiar with the area and may have been there for fishing or recreation, had encountered her by chance. In that moment, something dark within him had taken control, and he had attacked the teenage girl, raping her and then suffocating her in the shallow water to silence her forever. For Christy Hutchinson, Paul's wife, the revelation was devastating. The man she had married, the father of her children, had been living a lie for their entire relationship. She had believed him to be a good person, someone who had built an honest life. The discovery that he was a murderer shattered everything she thought she knew. The same was true for his adult children, who had to reconcile the father they loved with the monster who had committed such a horrific crime. The resolution of the case brought a complicated mixture of emotions to Danny's family. There was relief in finally knowing who had killed her, in having the answers they had sought for 28 years. There was validation in knowing that their faith in law enforcement had been justified, that the case had never been forgotten. But there was also frustration and anger that Paul Hutchinson had taken the coward's way out, ending his life before he could be arrested, tried, and sentenced for his crime. He would never sit in a courtroom and hear the impact statements from Danny's family. He would never face cross-examination or be forced to answer for what he had done. His suicide had robbed the Hutchins family of the full measure of justice they deserved. Yet in another sense, Hutchinson's suicide was its own form of confession. His extreme nervousness during the interview, his physical collapse when shown Danny's photograph, and his decision to kill himself rather than face the consequences all pointed to his guilt as clearly as any courtroom verdict could have. He knew what he had done, and when confronted with the reality that modern science had finally caught up to him after nearly 3 decades, he chose death over accountability. The investigation continued even after Hutchinson's death. Law enforcement officials stated that they would be sharing information with federal and local agencies in an attempt to determine if there might be other victims, other crimes that Hutchinson might have committed during his 28 years of freedom. The question lingered: had Danny been his only victim, or were there other young women who had encountered Paul Hutchinson in the wilderness and had not survived to tell their stories? For the community of Belgrade and Bozeman, the resolution of Danny's case was a reminder of both how far forensic science had come and how many cold cases might still be solved using these new techniques. Cece Moore, who had worked so diligently to identify Hutchinson through forensic genetic genealogy, had demonstrated that no case was too old, no evidence too degraded, to potentially yield answers if preserved properly and analyzed with the right tools. Danielle Hutchins was 15 years old when her life was stolen from her on a September afternoon in 1996. She was an outdoorsy teenager who loved Montana's wilderness, a young woman just beginning to discover who she would become. She had dreams and aspirations, a family who loved her, and a future that should have stretched out before her for decades. Instead, she became the victim of a random act of violence, murdered by a stranger who saw her vulnerability and chose to exploit it in the most brutal way imaginable. For 28 years, her family lived with the pain of not knowing who had killed her. They celebrated birthdays and holidays with an empty chair at the table. They watched Stephanie grow up without her big sister. They wondered every day if they would ever have answers, ever have justice. And then, in the summer of 2024, science and determination finally gave them what they had been seeking. The mystery was solved, the killer identified, and though he had escaped earthly justice through suicide, there was comfort in knowing that his guilt had been definitively established and that Danny's memory had been vindicated. The case of Danielle Hutchins stands as a testament to the importance of never giving up on victims, of preserving evidence even when solutions seem impossibly far away, and of embracing new technologies that can bring justice to families who have waited far too long for answers. Story 9. The sky over Minneapolis was a pale, indifferent gray, the kind that seemed to press down, heavy as regret. It was the morning of December 31st, 2019, New Year's Eve, that liminal day when hopes hang suspended and the world teeters between the past and what's to come. Monique Baugh zipped up her coat against the chill, gathered her real estate files, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She was 28, hustling for every sale, but more than that, she was a mother, a daughter, a woman intent on building something, her business, her life, her children's future. Monique was the kind of agent clients loved, polite but persistent, attentive, quick to smile. On that cold afternoon, she had a showing in Maple Grove. The appointment had come through a trusted company channel the day before. A new client, someone eager to view a property before the holiday. Just one more to finish the year, she texted her boyfriend, whose house was just across town. She slipped behind the wheel of her gray BMW, unaware that careful hands had set a trap and that she was stepping into the center of a meticulously designed web. Lyndon Akeem Wiggins was not a man who drifted. At 40, he'd learned to orchestrate, to control. Standing over 6 feet, he had presence, intense eyes, watchful, calculating. Wiggins, by then, had been circling the Minneapolis criminal underworld for years, his reputation as both a strategist and an enforcer well known. His romantic partner, Elsa Segura, was a former probation officer, bright, plausible, with a history that made her useful in ways few could imagine. What fueled Wiggins' plot wasn't greed but vengeance. Outlined a simmering feud with a rival drug dealer, a man named John Mitchell, who, by a twist both casual and cruel, happened to be Monique Baugh's boyfriend. Wiggins' plan was cold. find a way to Mitchell by luring Monique out, where she would be vulnerable, far from allies, and then strike where it hurt most. This would send a message, one written in terror and loss. The fake home viewing was Elsa's role. Using her professional skills and legitimate access, Elsa contacted Monique, arranging a last-minute showing in a residential neighborhood. The setup was flawless: emails, fake names, a convincing backstory. On the afternoon of December 31st, Monique pulled up on Humboldt Avenue North, clutching her folder, expecting to meet a prospective buyer. Surveillance would later show a U-Haul idling nearby. Moments after Monique stepped inside, Cedric Barry and Barry Davis, two men recruited by Wiggins, seized her, forced her into the U-Haul, and vanished down the street. The abduction was swift, clinical, and left almost no trace for passers-by. Neighbors, when asked, remembered nothing unusual. The street, like so many others, kept its secrets. Inside the dark, musty space of the truck, Monique's world narrowed. Her hands were bound. The cold seeped through her clothing. Each bump in the road was another step further from safety, another mile deeper into a nightmare. But panic, feral and hot, refused to let her give up. She pleaded, cried out, fought to breathe through the suffocating tape. She did not know where she was being taken or why this was happening. In those hours, her thoughts surely tumbled between fear and her children, faces she would not see again if rescue did not come. Meanwhile, at John Mitchell's house, life moved to the rhythm of an ordinary day. Then, the door exploded open. A masked gunman stormed in, bullets flying. John, startled and desperately trying to protect himself, was shot multiple times, left bleeding on the living room floor. The assailant fled into the winter dusk. A ghost melted into the city's anonymous edges. Miraculously, Mitchell survived the attack, but his world and Monique's had already been destroyed. The intention was unmistakable. This was a warning, a punishment. But that violence was only half the message. That evening, police were called to an alley near the 1300 block of Russell Avenue North, another anonymous street yielding to the grip of winter. There they found Monique's body, her hands bound with duct tape, gunshot wounds marking her final moments. The brutality of the act shocked even those seasoned in the city's darkest stories. As investigators combed the scene, flashing lights flickering, the night stretched taut. Neighbors gathered quietly, shaken by the horror thrust so close to home. The city rattled in the aftermath, but it was the skills of the investigators, methodical, dogged, that provided hope for justice. Surveillance footage placed the U-Haul at key locations. Phone records, subpoenaed and pored over, drew a web of contact that pointed again and again to the same circle of suspects. The digital trail, as damning as fingerprints, mapped out calls, routes, and meetings between Lyndon Wiggins, Elsa Segura, Barry Davis, and Cedric Barry. Each, in their way, tried to deny, to deflect. But the evidence was relentless. News media pored over every detail, the public watching as authorities pieced together the last hours of Monique Baugh's life. The abduction, the murder, the failed execution of John Mitchell. For Monique's family, her two daughters, her mother, her sisters, grief was a pit without bottom. She was remembered at candlelight vigils as funny, fierce, and loyal. She had so much more ahead of her, one relative said, voice cracking on live television. This is not just a headline. This is our life. Outside, snow fell, silent and indifferent. The legal process unwound its slow, grinding path. In June 2021, a Hennepin County jury convicted Cedric Barry and Barry Davis of aiding and abetting first-degree premeditated murder, attempted first-degree premeditated murder, kidnapping, and murder while committing kidnapping. Both men were sentenced to life in prison without parole, a verdict that brought little comfort to Monique's family, for whom no punishment could compensate the loss. Wiggins, whom prosecutors described as the mastermind of the entire plot, was found guilty later in 2021 on nearly identical charges. Elsa Segura, once an officer sworn to uphold the law, pleaded guilty in 2024 to kidnapping to commit great bodily harm, receiving a 20-year sentence. But even justice's slow hand is not always steady. In 2024, The Minnesota Supreme Court overturned Wiggins' initial conviction, finding that the jury's instructions had been legally flawed, too broad, allowing conviction without a full reckoning of Wiggins' personal intent and knowledge. For Monique's family, it felt like an old wound torn open, the hope of closure snatched away. The case returned to court for a retrial. In the fall of 2025, Wiggins faced justice again. Reporters thronged the steps of the courthouse. Inside, prosecutors laid out their evidence once more, the texts, the surveillance video, the looping calls and meetings. They described the plot, meticulous in its cruelty, that led to Monique's death. Wiggins, stoic, listened as the details were recounted. Witnesses, some trembling, some resolute, testified for hours. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man domineering and relentless, orchestrating others in the act, but holding the reins always. Monique was rendered vivid in testimony. Her warmth, her entrepreneurial drive, her love for her daughters. The effect on the jury was palpable. After nearly a month of testimony and days of deliberation, the verdict was read, guilty, again, on all charges of aiding and abetting first-degree premeditated murder, attempted murder, kidnapping to commit great bodily harm, and murder while committing kidnapping. For Monique's family, there was relief but also exhaustion. Nothing brings her back, but we hope this means another family will not go through what we did, a cousin said after the verdict. Wiggins faces a mandatory sentence of life in prison. Elsa Segura remains incarcerated. Barry and Davis will never see the streets again. In the funeral home where Monique's mother wept over her daughter's casket, the smallest gestures told the largest stories. A ribbon in her daughter's favorite color, hands held tight in silent comfort, her little girls drifting in and out of understanding. Minneapolis moved on, yet the city kept this absence, a candle in a window, an empty seat at Christmas, footprints in the winter that would never return. This wasn't just crime, the prosecutor said. This was a theft from the future, a woman, a mother, taken by the greed and rage of others. Police officers attended the vigil, heads bowed. Colleagues shared stories of Monique's humor and her drive, her hopes to buy her mother a home and enroll her children in better schools. Listeners to the story wondered at the senselessness. The community, for a while, grew closer, wary and yet determined, keeping watch for its own. No one who was part of it remained unchanged. The justice system, battered and tested, still struggled to keep up with the sweep of tragedy. But Monique Baugh is remembered. Her two daughters carry her memory, and the ripples of her absence touch all who hear her name. A reminder of the ordinary dangers that can become extraordinary in the hands of those who plot destruction. And as each New Year's Eve arrives and a cold wind settles over Minneapolis, many think back to 2019, to a woman lost in the darkness between years and the hope, however fragile, that justice endures. Story 10. The coastal suburb of South Fremantle, Western Australia, sits where the Indian Ocean meets the urban sprawl of Perth, a place where the salt air mingles with the scent of eucalyptus, and life moves at a pace somewhere between city hustle and beachside tranquility. In May 2012, this ordinary neighborhood became the setting for an act of violence so shocking that it would haunt the community for years to come. At the center of this tragedy stood three young people whose lives had become entangled in a web of drug addiction, psychological trauma, and ultimately, unspeakable brutality. Among them was 19-year-old Amanda Jane Kelly, a woman whose childhood laughter had once earned her the affectionate nickname Foghorn from her sisters, but whose life had spiraled into darkness long before that fateful night when 24-year-old David Houston knocked on a stranger's door. Amanda Kelly's story did not begin with violence. Born and raised in the remote reaches of Western Australia's north, she had been a child like any other, with a laugh so loud and joyful it filled rooms and made her family smile. But beneath the surface of that childhood happiness lurked shadows that would eventually consume her. By the age of 12, Amanda had already begun experimenting with drugs, a dangerous coping mechanism for a girl struggling with depression, anxiety, and a preoccupation with death that seemed to darken every corner of her young mind. Self-harm became another outlet for her pain, the physical wounds a visible manifestation of the psychological torment she carried inside. Had been nothing short of tragic, marked by dysfunction and instability that left her vulnerable to the wrong influences and desperate for connection. As Amanda grew older, her mental health deteriorated further. She was eventually diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a condition that can create intense and often irrational attachments to other people, swinging between idealization and devaluation in relationships. For someone like Amanda, whose life had been defined by instability and trauma, this disorder meant that when she formed a connection with someone, it became all-consuming, an anchor in the storm of her chaotic existence. She also exhibited symptoms of possible schizophrenia, adding another layer of complexity to her already fragile mental state. The combination of drug abuse, mental illness, and a dependent personality created a perfect storm, leaving Amanda susceptible to manipulation and control by those who recognized her vulnerability. It was in this state that Amanda met Jonathan Robert Lee, a 23-year-old man who would become both her boyfriend and her undoing. Lee was manipulative, domineering, and violent, the kind of person who thrived on control and fed on the weaknesses of others. For Amanda, whose borderline personality disorder made her fixate on people with an intensity that bordered on obsession, Lee became the center of her universe. She clung to him with a desperation born of her need for stability and connection, even as his influence pulled her deeper into a world of drug use and criminality. By the spring of 2012, Amanda was living with Lee and another man, 27-year-old Sam Jacob Walker, in Walker's family home in South Fremantle. The three of them shared a lifestyle built on drugs, their days and nights blurring together in a haze of intoxication and escalating dysfunction. On an evening in May 2012, David Houston made a decision that would cost him his life. The 24-year-old had agreed to deliver drugs to the house in South Fremantle where Walker, Lee, and Kelly were staying. David was likely just trying to make some money or do a favor, unaware that he was walking into a situation that would spiral horrifically out of control. When he arrived at the house, the atmosphere was already thick with the paranoia and aggression that often accompanies prolonged drug use. Walker and Lee had been on a drug binge for days, consuming in quantities that distorted their perception of reality and stripped away any semblance of rational thought. Amanda, too, had been using heavily, her already fragile mental state further compromised by the chemicals coursing through her system. What started as a drug transaction quickly devolved into something far more sinister. The details of how the situation escalated remain unclear, lost in the fog of drug-induced paranoia and violence. But at some point, David Houston became the target of Walker's rage. Perhaps there was a dispute over money or drugs, or perhaps the drugs had simply unleashed the worst in Walker's nature. Whatever the trigger, the violence that followed was as brutal as it was senseless. Amanda was in the bathroom, engaged with Lee in the shower, when the first screams pierced the air. The sounds of David's terror echoed through the house, a desperate plea for help that would go unanswered. When Amanda emerged from the bathroom and confused, she walked into a scene of horror. In the kitchen, Sam Walker had already wrapped a ligature around David Houston's neck and was strangling him with methodical brutality. David's face was contorted in agony, his hands clawing at the cord cutting off his air supply, his body convulsing in a futile attempt to break free. Walker, his eyes wild with the effects of the drugs and whatever dark impulses drove him, barked an order at Amanda. He commanded her to help him, to take hold of the ligature and participate in the act of killing this helpless man. For 20 to 30 seconds that must have felt like an eternity, Amanda complied. She placed her hands on the ligature and pulled, adding her strength to Walker's as David Houston's life ebbed away beneath their hands. The horror of what she was doing overwhelmed Amanda almost immediately. After less than half a minute, she released her grip and stumbled back to the bathroom, where she bent over and vomited, her body's involuntary rejection of the atrocity she had just committed. But even as Amanda retched in the bathroom, the violence in the kitchen continued and intensified. Jonathan Lee, the man she loved with an intensity that had blinded her to his true nature, joined Walker in the attack. The two men dragged David's limp body to the shower, perhaps hoping to revive him or simply to contain the mess. But David Houston was not yet dead. Somehow, despite the strangulation and beating he had already endured, he regained consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, and he gasped for air, a final spark of life refusing to be extinguished. For Lee and Walker, this was an inconvenience to be eliminated. Lee responded with a fury that defied comprehension, kicking David with such savage force that the bones of his face shattered. One blow was so powerful that David's left eye bulged out of its socket, a grotesque testament to the violence being inflicted upon him. Walker continued the assault, stomping and punching David's head and chest until his body finally went still. When the pathologist later examined David Houston's remains, the injuries catalogued would paint a picture of a man who had been subjected to unimaginable suffering in his final moments. Severe head and chest trauma marked his body, but the ultimate cause of death was determined to be neck compression, the ligature having crushed his windpipe and cut off the oxygen to his brain. With David Houston dead, the three young people in that house faced a decision. They could call the police, confess what had happened, and face the consequences. Or they could try to hide the crime and hope that no one would ever discover what they had done. Amanda, despite the horror she had witnessed and participated in, did not attempt to help David or contact law enforcement. Instead, she helped Walker and Lee dispose of the body. The men wrapped David's corpse in a barbecue cover, the mundane household item now serving as a makeshift shroud. Amanda, still reeling from the events of the night, helped carry the body to a vehicle. The weight of David's lifeless form, the cold reality of what they had done, must have been unbearable, but Amanda went through the motions, her actions guided by fear, loyalty to Lee, or perhaps a complete dissociation from reality. Sam Walker took the driver's seat and headed south, away from the city lights and into the darkness of the Western Australian bush. The vehicle traveled approximately 130 kilometers to an area near Binningup, a small coastal town just south of Bunbury. There, in the scrubland that stretched endlessly under the night sky, Walker and Lee dug a shallow grave. They placed David Houston's body into the earth, but they did not simply cover it with soil. In a calculated attempt to accelerate decomposition and eliminate evidence, they poured acid over the corpse, then added lime and concrete, creating a crude barrier between David and the world that had once been his home. A final indignity inflicted upon a man whose only crime had been showing up at the wrong house on the wrong night. For a time, it seemed as though the three might get away with murder. David Houston was reported missing by his family, who grew increasingly frantic as days turned into weeks with no word from him. Police launched an investigation, but without a body or clear evidence of foul play, the case stalled. Amanda, Walker, and Lee returned to their lives, or at least tried to. But the weight of what they had done hung over them like a dark cloud, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. The GPS system in the rental vehicle Walker had used to transport David's body. Detectives, following leads and piecing together David's last known movements, obtained the GPS data and traced the vehicle's route. The digital breadcrumbs led them directly to the burial site near Binningup. When police excavated the area, they found David Houston's remains, partially decomposed but still identifiable. The discovery confirmed the family's worst fears and set in motion a series of arrests that would bring Amanda Kelly, Jonathan Lee, and Sam Walker into custody. The three were charged with murder, and as the details of the crime emerged during police interviews and court proceedings, the community reacted with shock and revulsion. This was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was a prolonged and brutal attack, fueled by drugs and devoid of any apparent motive beyond senseless violence. Amanda Jane Kelly's arrest marked a turning point in her life. Held at Bandyup Women's Prison, she was finally separated from Jonathan Lee and the toxic environment that had defined her recent years. In custody, she was heavily sedated and admitted to the Franklin Center, where she received proper medication for her mental health conditions. For the first time in years, according to her sister Alicia, Amanda seemed to be stabilizing. The medication helped manage her symptoms, and the structure of prison life, as grim as it was, provided a stability she had never known on the outside. As the legal proceedings moved forward, Amanda faced the reality of what she had done and the consequences that awaited her. In January 2013, appearing in court via video link from Bandyup prison, she entered a guilty plea to murder. Her defense attorneys argued that she had walked into a situation she did not create, and that her role in the crime was significantly less than that of Walker and Lee. They pointed to her mental health issues, her troubled upbringing, and the control Lee had exerted over her. A letter from Lee himself, submitted to the court, claimed that Amanda had wanted to go to the police after the murder, but had been persuaded not to through guilt trips, manipulation, and threats. The letter also revealed that Lee had attempted to continue their relationship from prison, but Amanda had resisted, finally breaking free from the man who had led her down such a dark path. Despite these mitigating factors, the prosecution and the court recognized that Amanda had participated in the murder. For 20 to 30 seconds, she had helped strangle David Houston. She had not called for help, had not tried to stop the violence, and had assisted in disposing of the body. These were not the actions of an innocent bystander, but of someone who, regardless of her diminished capacity and manipulated state, had played a role in taking a life. In November 2013, Amanda appeared in court for sentencing. Her defense team made a final plea for mercy, arguing that she should be spared a life sentence given her age, mental health, and lesser culpability. But the judge, Justice Michael Corboy, ultimately concluded that the severity of the crime warranted the mandatory life sentence for murder. On December 8, 2013, just one day before her 21st birthday, Amanda Jane Kelly received her sentence. Justice Corboy acknowledged that her culpability was much lower than that of Walker and Lee, that she had expressed remorse, and that she had suffered years of mental health issues. But he also emphasized that she had participated in a particularly horrific crime and had failed to disassociate herself from the gross violence inflicted upon David Houston. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 14 years. When the sentence was handed down, Amanda collapsed in tears, the weight of those words crushing whatever fragile hope she might have held for a different outcome. Sam Jacob Walker and Jonathan Robert Lee, whose roles in the murder were far more active and brutal, each received life sentences with a minimum non-parole period of 21 years. The state prosecutors had appealed their initial sentences, arguing that the brutality and gratuitous nature of the violence warranted a longer minimum term, and the court agreed. For David Houston's family, the sentencing brought a measure of closure, though nothing could undo the loss they had suffered or erase the horror of how David had died. Outside the courthouse, they declined to comment beyond expressing relief that the ordeal was finally over. In the years since her sentencing, Amanda Kelly has remained in Bandyup Women's Prison, serving her time and attempting to rebuild some semblance of a life behind bars. She and her sister Alicia have maintained their relationship, spending their phone conversations working on crochet projects together, a small connection to normalcy and family in an otherwise bleak existence. Amanda's story serves as a cautionary tale about the devastating intersection of mental illness, drug abuse, and toxic relationships. It is a reminder that behind every crime, no matter how horrific, there are human beings whose lives have been shaped by trauma, poor choices, and circumstances beyond their control. David Houston's family continues to live with the loss of a son, a brother, a friend whose life was cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. His death was not the result of a carefully planned murder, but a spontaneous eruption of violence fueled by drugs and the darkest impulses of human nature. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of a crime that never should have happened. For Amanda Kelly, now in her early 30s, the years stretch ahead in a blur of prison routine and the knowledge that she played a role, however diminished by mental illness and manipulation, in ending another person's life. Whether she will find redemption, whether she can ever truly atone for what happened that night in South Fremantle, remains a question without an easy answer. What is certain is that the murder of David Houston destroyed multiple lives, leaving a trail of grief, regret, and unanswered questions in its wake. Story 11. The cold November wind swept across Lincoln, Nebraska, carrying with it the first hints of the approaching winter. 24-year-old Sydney Luff was excited as she finished her shift at Menards, a sprawling hardware store where she worked as a cashier. It was November 15th, 2017, and Sydney had plans that evening that filled her with nervous anticipation. Like millions of other young people navigating the complexities of modern dating, she had connected with someone on Tinder, a popular dating app that promised connection in an increasingly digital world. This would be her second date with a woman named Bailey Boswell, and Sydney had told friends and family about her plans, sharing the small details of her life as she always did. Sydney was the kind of person who lit up a room without trying. Her family and friends knew her as someone with a gentle spirit, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. Working at Menards had given her a sense of independence and purpose, and she took pride in showing up reliably for every shift. When she left work that November evening, she had no way of knowing that she would never return, that her co-workers would soon be calling her phone with growing concern, wondering why she hadn't shown up for her next scheduled shift. The date she was heading toward would become the last journey of her young life, a meeting orchestrated not by chance or romance, but by calculated malice. Bailey Boswell, 23 years old at the time, had grown up in southern Iowa before making her way to Nebraska. She lived in a basement apartment in the small town of Wilbur, about 40 miles southwest of Lincoln, and she shared that space and her life with a man named Aubrey Trail. Trail was 51 years old, nearly 3 decades Boswell's senior, and he had built a life around manipulation and control. Together, they had created an unusual arrangement that involved fraud, group encounters, and a twisted philosophy that valued their desires above all else. Trail had a criminal history and a disturbing pattern of coercing women into his unconventional lifestyle, and in Boswell, he had found someone willing to follow his lead into increasingly dark territory. The relationship between Trail and Boswell was complex and troubling. They had already been involved in criminal enterprises together, defrauding an elderly Kansas couple out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in gold coins and collectibles through elaborate schemes. But as November 2017 approached, their activities were about to cross into territory far more sinister. Trail and Boswell had begun planning to kill someone. That murder itself had become part of Trail's twisted fantasies, and that Boswell had become an active participant in bringing those fantasies to life. They needed someone vulnerable, someone who could be lured and isolated, and they turned to the world of online dating to find their victim. Sydney's first date with Bailey Boswell had occurred on November 14th, just one day before her disappearance. The two women had connected on Tinder, exchanging messages that seemed innocent enough on the surface. Boswell presented herself as friendly and interested, and Sydney, who was open to meeting new people, agreed to spend time with her. That first date apparently went well enough that Sydney agreed to a second meeting the following evening. She had no reason to suspect that Bailey Boswell was anything other than what she appeared to be. No way to know that Bailey's boyfriend, Aubrey Trail, was orchestrating events from the shadows. What Sydney didn't know was that even as she was finishing her shift at Menards on November 15th, Trail and Boswell were already deep into their preparations. Security cameras at a Home Depot store in Lincoln captured footage that would later become crucial evidence in the case. The video showed Trail and Boswell walking through the aisles, selecting items with chilling purpose: hacksaws, trash bags, bleach, and various tools. They made these purchases while Sydney was still alive, still working her shift, still looking forward to the evening ahead. The premeditation was undeniable, captured in stark detail by surveillance footage that showed two people buying the instruments of murder hours before the act itself. When Sydney left to meet Bailey that evening, she sent messages to friends and family, small check-ins that marked the ordinary moments of her life. But after she arrived at the basement apartment in Wilbur, those messages stopped. The world outside continued spinning, unaware that something terrible was unfolding in that small town, in that basement apartment where the smell of bleach would soon permeate every surface. Sydney's phone went silent, her social media accounts inactive, and when she failed to show up for her next shift at Menards on November 16th, her co-workers knew immediately that something was wrong. Sydney was reliable, conscientious, not the type to simply disappear without explanation. Sydney's mother reported her missing on November 16th, her voice likely trembling as she explained to authorities that her daughter had gone on a date and never came home. The Lincoln Police Department launched an investigation immediately, and cell phone records quickly led them to Bailey Boswell's name and address in Wilbur. When investigators approached the basement apartment, the landlord who lived upstairs mentioned something disturbing. A powerful smell of bleach had been coming from the lower level, strong enough to be noticed throughout the building. When police entered the apartment, they found evidence that someone had frantically attempted to clean the space. Portions of the walls had been wiped down, surfaces scrubbed, all in what appeared to be a desperate effort to erase evidence of violence. In the days following Sydney's disappearance, Trail and Boswell attempted to control the narrative. They posted a video on social media proclaiming their innocence, with Boswell claiming that she and Sydney had used substances together at her home before she dropped Sydney off at a friend's house. She said they had planned to go to a casino together that weekend, but that she hadn't heard from Sydney since. The video was strange and unsettling, an odd mixture of defensiveness and false concern that only heightened suspicions rather than allaying them. Law enforcement was already piecing together a different story, one told by cell tower data, surveillance footage, and physical evidence. As the investigation intensified, the search for Sydney expanded across the rural counties surrounding Lincoln. Volunteers joined law enforcement officers, combing through fields and ditches, hoping against hope that Sydney might still be found alive. But hope began to fade as days turned into weeks. Then, on December 5, 2017, the search came to a heartbreaking end. In rural Clay County, about 90 miles southwest of Lincoln, investigators made a grim discovery. Garbage bags had been dumped along country roads and ditches, scattered across the desolate landscape. Inside those bags were Sydney's remains, her body dismembered and cut into 14 pieces. The brutality of the discovery sent shockwaves through Nebraska and beyond. Sydney Luff, a young woman who had simply been trying to navigate the modern world of dating and connection, had been murdered and disposed of with callous disregard. The investigation now shifted from a missing person case to a homicide investigation, and all evidence pointed directly at Trail and Boswell. Cell tower data showed that their phones had been in the areas where Sydney's remains were found. Store receipts confirmed their purchase of the tools found near the disposal sites. And as investigators interviewed Trail, his story began to unravel. Initially, Trail attempted to claim that Boswell was innocent, that he alone was responsible for Sydney's death. He told investigators that Sydney had died accidentally during rough activities, a claim he would later change multiple times. But the physical evidence painted a different picture. Trail eventually acknowledged during police interviews that he had strangled Sydney with an extension cord, that her death had been violent and intentional. He admitted to the strangulation, but continued to shift his story about the circumstances and about Boswell's involvement, trying different narratives to see which might minimize the consequences. In June 2018, Trail and Boswell were formally charged with first-degree murder and improper disposal of human remains. The Nebraska Attorney General's office took over the prosecution, recognizing the significance and complexity of the case. As the legal proceedings moved forward, prosecutors built a case not just around the murder itself, but around the conspiracy that had led to it. They argued that Trail and Boswell had planned Sydney's killing before it occurred, that the purchases of tools and supplies while Sydney was still alive demonstrated clear premeditation. Additional charges of conspiracy to commit murder were added, reflecting the prosecution's belief that this had been a joint enterprise. Trail's trial began in the summer of 2019, and it was marked by shocking moments that captivated public attention. In June, Trail pleaded guilty to one charge, the improper disposal of Sydney's remains. But as the trial progressed and it became clear that a conviction on the murder charges was likely, Trail's behavior became increasingly erratic. On June 28, 2019, in a moment of explosive rage, Trail stood up in court and shouted that Bailey Boswell was innocent, that she knew nothing about his plans. Then, in front of the shocked courtroom, he pulled out what appeared to be a razor blade and slashed his own neck, cursing everyone present before collapsing. The wounds were not life-threatening, but the incident forced a pause in the proceedings as Trail refused to return to court for several days. When the trial resumed, prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence. Clerks from a hotel in Falls City testified that they had seen a woman who could have been Sydney with Trail and Boswell weeks before her disappearance, suggesting that Sydney might have been selected as a target well before her death. Surveillance footage showed Trail and Boswell checking into a hotel near the Menards where Sydney worked on November 14th, the day before her murder, positioning themselves close to their intended victim. The cell tower data, the store receipts, the condition of the apartment, and Trail's own admissions all came together to form an inescapable conclusion. On July 9, 2019, the jury took less than 3 hours to reach their verdict. They found Aubrey Trail guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human skeletal remains. Trail requested a new trial, but Judge Vicky Johnson denied the motion. The case then moved to the sentencing phase, where a 3-judge panel would determine whether Trail should receive the death penalty or life in prison. In court documents supporting the death penalty, prosecutors argued that Trail had a history of assaultive and terrorizing criminal activity, and that Sydney's murder manifested exceptional depravity by ordinary standards of morality and intelligence. During the sentencing hearing in June 2021, Trail made a final statement to the court. In a dramatic reversal, he recanted his earlier claim that Sydney had died during unusual activities and admitted that he had strangled her with an electric cord, exactly as prosecutors had alleged. He explained that he had tied Sydney up and killed her because she became frightened when he told her about his lifestyle involving fraud and group activities, that she had freaked out, and he had decided to eliminate her rather than let her leave. Trail insisted that Boswell had not been in the room during the killing and didn't know he was going to do it, but the evidence suggested otherwise. He told the court that he didn't care what sentence he received, that he was not looking for mercy or forgiveness. Judge Vicky Johnson, after considering all the evidence and arguments, concluded that Sydney's murder met the legal standard of exceptional depravity necessary to impose capital punishment. She noted that Trail had changed his story numerous times throughout the investigation and trial, demonstrating a pattern of dishonesty and manipulation. She referenced evidence that Trail had bragged about the murder to other inmates. On June 9, 2021, the 3-judge panel unanimously sentenced Aubrey Trail to death, making him one of only a handful of inmates on Nebraska's death row. Trail appealed the sentence, even requesting to represent himself, but his appeals were denied. In November 2022, the Nebraska Supreme Court rejected his appeal, affirming both his conviction and his death sentence. Bailey Boswell's case followed a separate path through the court system. She requested a change of venue due to the intense media coverage and public sentiment in the Lincoln area, and her request was granted. Her trial took place in October 2020, and the prosecution presented much of the same evidence that had convicted Trail, along with additional evidence about Boswell's role in luring Sydney and participating in the murder and disposal. Boswell's defense attorneys argued that she had been coerced by Trail, that his control over her was so complete that she was not truly responsible for her actions. They painted her as a victim of Trail's manipulation, someone caught in the orbit of a dangerous predator. But the jury did not accept that defense. The evidence showed that Boswell had actively participated in every stage of the crime, from making contact with Sydney on Tinder, to accompanying Trail to purchase the murder weapons and disposal tools, to to helping clean the crime scene and dispose of Sydney's body. Cell phone records and surveillance footage placed her at every crucial moment. On October 27, 2020, the jury convicted Bailey Boswell of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and improper disposal of human remains. Like Trail, she faced a potential death sentence, and the case moved to a sentencing phase before a three-judge panel. In November 2021, the panel announced Boswell's sentence. While one judge believed her actions met the standard for capital punishment, the other two judges concluded that her crimes, while heinous, did not rise to the level of exceptional depravity required for the death penalty under Nebraska law. Bailey Boswell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. If she had received the death penalty, she would have become Nebraska's first female death row inmate. Instead, she will spend the remainder of her life behind bars, her youth and future erased by the choices she made in November 2017. The case of Sydney Luft resonated far beyond Nebraska's borders, raising uncomfortable questions about safety in the age of online dating and the vulnerability that comes with trusting strangers met through digital platforms. Sydney's family was left to grapple with an unimaginable loss, their daughter's life cut short by people who saw her not as a human being, but as an object to be used and discarded. Throughout the trials, the prosecution emphasized that Sydney was a real person with hopes, dreams, relationships, and a future that was stolen from her. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a co-worker, someone whose absence left a permanent void in the lives of those who loved her. The legal proceedings brought some measure of justice, with both perpetrators convicted and sentenced to spend the rest of their lives removed from society. But justice could not bring Sydney back, could not undo the violence inflicted upon her, could not heal the trauma experienced by her family and community. The case served as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind ordinary appearances, that predators can use modern technology to identify and isolate victims, and that vigilance and caution remain essential even in an age of unprecedented connection. Sydney Luft's name became synonymous with the dangers lurking in seemingly innocent online interactions, a cautionary tale that spread across social media and news outlets, prompting conversations about how to stay safe in the digital dating landscape. Nebraska rarely carries out executions, and the state currently lacks the drugs necessary to implement lethal injection, making it unlikely that Aubrey Trail's death sentence will be carried out in the near future. He remains on death row, his appeals exhausted, while Bailey Boswell serves her life sentence in a separate facility. Both have become pariahs, their names forever linked to one of Nebraska's most disturbing crimes in recent memory. The basement apartment in Wilbur where Sydney spent her final moments has become a place of infamy. The country roads where her remains were scattered now associated with tragedy, rather than the quiet rural peace they once represented. For Sydney's family and friends, the pain of her loss continues long after the trials concluded and the sentences were handed down. They remember her not as a victim, but as the vibrant young woman she was, full of kindness and life. They have worked to keep her memory alive in ways that honor who she was rather than how she died, though that task is made more difficult by the public nature of her case and the sensational details that emerged during the trials. The trauma of losing someone to violence is compounded when that violence becomes the subject of intense media scrutiny, when the most private grief is played out in courtrooms and news coverage. Sydney Luft's story is a tragedy that speaks to the fragility of safety and the devastating consequences when predators identify vulnerable targets. It reveals the dark potential of human nature when empathy and conscience are absent, when other people are viewed merely as means to an end. But it is also a story about justice, about law enforcement officers who worked tirelessly to find Sydney and bring her killers to account, about prosecutors who built meticulous cases to ensure convictions, and about juries who carefully weighed evidence to reach just verdicts. In the end, Sydney's death resulted in two people being held accountable for their crimes, removed from society so they could never harm anyone else. That accountability mattered, even though it could never be enough, could never restore what was lost on that cold November evening in 2017 when a young woman went on a date and never came home.